Long before the Smoky Mountains ever became America's most popular national park, it was home to some of the most legendary mountaineers who feared neither man nor beast. Join us as we count down the top 10 men and women to ever call the Smoky Mountains home. Kicking off our countdown is a woman so fiercely independent that there should be statues and maybe even postage stamps in her honor. Coming in at number 10 is the legendary Sophie Campbell. The year is 1805, and Thomas Ogle and his young wife have spent the past 4 months migrating from the state of Georgia across the rugged Smoky Mountains into eastern Tennessee, where the young couple settles in a narrow valley located at the foot of Mount LeConte. The valley was a paradise, the mountains wrapped around it like a mother's arms, isolating it from the outside world. There was a beautiful, crystal-clear mountain river, brimming with fish, majestic timber stands, bountiful wild game, and plenty of fertile soil, everything a man needed to raise a family. So it was here that the Ogle family decided to build their lives. Using little more than an axe, Thomas felled trees and used the logs to build a modest cabin and a rail fence that carved out his little piece of the mountains, and they settled into their new homeland. They named this Garden of Eden White Oak Flats, and here the couple would raise 14 young'uns in this paradise. Over time, a few other families arrived and also made this magical place their home, building a church to worship and educate their children. Because of its isolation, the people who lived here were a hardy breed. They raised all their own food and made all their own tools, implements, clothing, and furniture. They learned the ancient crafts of basket weaving and broom making from the natives who also lived in the area. And for the next 50 years, the small inhabitants of this valley thrived and grew underneath the shadow of the mighty Smoky Mountains. It was here that a little girl named Sophie Ogle was born in 1855. Born of the same pioneer stock as her grandfather, Sophie roamed the mountains barefooted, just as freely as the animals did. She played in rows of corn taller than she was, climbed the sturdy branches of the chestnut trees, learned to spear fish, and was an excellent shot with her father's hog-killing rifle. She followed her pa, who was a lean, weathered man with hands as calloused as rocks, as he plowed the fields or chopped firewood, and he'd tell her, "Sophie, this land's been good to us. It'll keep you safe and feed you if you treat it right." Sophie was a child of the mountains, connected to the land and the animals of the forest. Her mother taught her how to spin wool and weave cloth, to can and preserve, and to make medicines from herbs that she picked from the woods. Sophie would watch wide-eyed as her mother boiled sassafras roots to make tea or pulled fresh greens from the ground to add to the evening meal. She spent countless hours wandering through the woods, learning the songs of the birds and the tracks of the deer. She felt as though the mountains were part of her, in her blood, her bones. Occasionally, travelers or traders would pass through. Their packs would be loaded with things she had never seen: brightly dyed cloth, shiny tin cups, and even a strange little lantern that didn't use fire at all. She'd listen to their tales of far-off cities and bustling towns, places where people lived shoulder to shoulder, where the nights were lit up brighter than the day. She listened to their tales of Roman railroad tracks being laid down south and cities growing like weeds across the land. She watched with fascination, but she felt no pull to join that life. The mountains, her father said, would shield her from the world's rushing tide. However, little did he know that what was about to happen would forever change this mountain paradise. So it was. Sophie grew up mountain strong, living on her family farm. She was a fierce, independent woman who was now in her early 20s. Many folks openly wondered why she hadn't been married by now. But the truth was that Sophie was waiting on a man who was just as strong and independent as she was. And that finally happened in 1879, when a man named Tom Campbell was hired to work on the Ogle farm. Now, Tom wasn't much to look at. His clothes were well worn and dirty, and he didn't have much money. But when it came to work, Tom could work circles around other men, clearing the land and chopping wood, mending fences, or plowing all day long behind a mule. Tom could do it all. He himself had grown up just like Sophie, wild and free. And before long, the pair got spliced down at the Baptist church. Tom took all the money he had in the world, $7.80, and he bought 25 acres high atop Harrison Mountain, which overlooked the valley below. The mountaintop, it was a utopia. There was a big spring full of the sweetest tasting water. Dogwoods and redbud trees were flowering, and they were magnets for wild honeybees. Yes, sir, it was perfect for Tom and Sophie. No neighbors, and no one from the outside world to bother him either. Tom got busy building a home for his new bride. He chopped down trees and hewed them into logs for a small cabin that he built to Sophie's wishes. He split boards for the roof and chopped rock out of the side of the mountaintop for a chimney and a hearth. But he still needed boards for the flooring, so he carried them up plank by plank, 2 miles up each trip to the top of the steep mountain. And I mean steep. You see, no 4-legged critter or no wagon or cart, nothing on wheels, had ever made the zagged and twisty climb to the top. All totaled, Tom carried 1,500 feet of pine and poplar up the mountain on his back, and as a wedding gift for Sophie, he even carried a cast-iron cook stove to the very top. There the 2 mountain pioneers lived and raised their crops and their children. Tom eventually carried up a baby calf, some chickens, and a pig up the mountain, and he even managed to get a small mule up to the top. That's right, Tom and Sophie had built a kingdom in the clouds, and there, for the next 40 years, they would remain hidden from the outside world. And once their children were grown, each one headed off down to the valley below to start their own lives, leaving Sophie and Tom to live alone with the animals on top of Harrison Mountain. Yet, winds of change began blowing across the hills and hollers, and the outside world began creeping in. First, there was that road that they cut down in the valley, and soon, folks from the outside world were now showing up in automobiles from faraway lands like Knoxville, and they were there to buy the handcrafted items produced by the local craftsmen. Everything from linens, rugs, tapestries, furniture, jewelry, and cigarette boxes, even bookends. With all this new attention from those outsiders, word began to spread far and wide about this majestic valley sitting at the foot of the Smoky Mountains. And by the 1920s, the area even caught the attention of the government. And I'm sure you know by now, the most feared words a man can ever hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I tell you, no truer words have ever been spoken. And suddenly, the government decided that all the land the mountaineers were living on should be a national park. Sophie and Tom watched as one by one, all of the small hillside farms were bought by the government, and longtime neighbors moved away. Those who fought the government and tried to remain were simply removed by eminent domain. And let's be honest, eminent domain is just a fancy word for legal thievery. Sophie and Tom were one of the few original families who were able to remain as the small valley was gobbled up by investors. Suddenly, their small valley was becoming a tourist attraction, and even the name was changed from White Oak Flats to Gatlinburg. That's right, Gatlinburg had become the gateway to the Smokies, and tourists began flocking in by the tens of thousands. Hotels sprang up everywhere, and this once hidden oasis was being featured in magazines and newspapers all across the world. Hey guys, JD Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller, and we're here on site in Gatlinburg, Tennessee at White Oak Flats Cemetery. And this is where Sophie Campbell is buried. Now, she's buried right under this tree right here. And I wanted to go over there, and I actually did go over there, and I was going to film her grave, but I kept feeling something falling on my head, and I looked up, and there's a mama bear right there in that tree, and she's eating some nuts, and I'm not going to bother her. But anyways, Sophia is buried right under that tree, and she lived during her life on this mountain up here behind me. And when she died, they wanted to take a casket up there and bury her on top of the mountain, but it was so steep they literally couldn't get the casket up there. So they put Sophia gently in a sheet and like a hammock. They brought her down that mountain right there, and they buried her right here at White Oak Flats Cemetery, underneath that tree where that mama bear is now. And now, back to the story. Before long, tourists learned about the old couple who were still living on top of the mountain that overlooked Gatlinburg, and they began fording the river and making the long climb to the top of the mountain to visit them. They marveled at Sophie's handmade tobacco pipes and Tom's hand-carved furniture. The tourists craved to just sit on the porch and listen to them tell of how the mountains used to be. At first, Sophie and Tom didn't know what to make about all this attention. But being the wily and canny mountaineers that they were, they adapted. They began welcoming the tourists, and Tom sold them hand-carved trinkets and fresh honey, while Sophie sold them fresh, hot pies and handmade clay pipes that she had hardened on the fireplace. The old couple were now living windows into the past, some of the last pioneers who the world now knew as Uncle Tom and Aunt Sophie. By 1930, National Geographic reporters even climbed to the top of Harrison Mountain to meet the couple who were now in their 70s. Aunt Sophie beamed with pride as she talked about her boy who lived just across the gap, or her gal who had moved off to Alabama. Sophie had spent her entire life in these mountains, and when the reporter asked her if she could have one wish, what would it be? Sophie took a long toke off of her pipe, and with a faraway look in her eyes, she looked out over the mountains that had been her home for so long, and she said, "I'd like to see the ocean with my own eyes." Yet it would never be, because on a cold winter day in January of 1936, Aunt Sophie Campbell passed away peacefully in the cabin that she had lived in for 45 years, the same one that Tom had built for her. When folks down in Gatlinburg got the news, a group of men shoveled their way through the snow and ice to the top of Harrison Mountain, and they gently and lovingly carried Aunt Sophie's body down the mountain and laid her to rest in White Oak Flats. As for Uncle Tom, now he remained on the mountain with his hunting dogs and the wild animals as his only friends. One autumn morning, as the leaves were turning crimson and gold, Tom sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The world outside was quiet, and there, in the warmth of their cabin, he closed his eyes for one last time, his spirit finally at rest, ready to join Sophie on the other side. The men of Gatlinburg found him a day later, sitting in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, his face peaceful. They carried him down the mountain, just as they had Sophie, and laid him to rest right beside her. The last of the old mountain ways were now gone.
Born in 1855, in White Oak Flat she come alive. Barefoot girl with rifle in hand, she walked the hills and knew the land. Mama taught her herbs and thread, this land will keep you fed. She knew them woods like breath and bone. Those Smoky Mountains were her home. Oh, and Sophie, mountain strong, lived where the old ways still belong. High on Harrison, wild and free, just her and the memory.
Today, 14 million people a year visit Gatlinburg. The once small valley, known as White Oak Flats, is now packed full of hotels, restaurants, and gift shops, all owned by multi-billion-dollar corporations. Most folks today visit for moonshine tastings and quick wedding ceremonies. Most of them have no idea of the history of the old pioneers, such as Uncle Tom and Aunt Sophie, who still rest today in a small cemetery just a few feet off the tourist-packed streets. And as for Sophie and Tom's cabin up on the mountain, well, it was bulldozed years ago to build a ski resort now known as Ober-Gatlinburg.
Up next on our list is a man who refused to let the government take his God-given right to liberty and independence. And in the process, he became an absolute legend. Coming in at number 9 is the incredible story of Lim Ownby.
Imagine being the last person ever allowed to live in the majestic Smoky Mountains. This is the true story of Lim Ownby. Our story begins in 1863, during the turmoil of the bloody war between the states. That's when Thomas and Sarah Ownby wanted to get as far away from the conflict as they possibly could. So, with little more than a gun, a Bible, and a broadaxe, they cut their way deep into the forest of the Great Smoky Mountains. Higher and higher they climbed, until they reached a place so remote that the old-timers called it just back of beyond, a mountain oasis that would one day become known as Elkmont. Here, they would plant the roots of their lives together. Now, Thomas was a simple man who believed that if he couldn't buy anything he needed, he would just make it. And if he couldn't make it, he would just do without. And make it he did, surrounded by every conceivable wild animal: bears, wolves, panthers, and mountain lions. Thomas cleared out a patch of land and hewed yellow poplar logs and built his bride a small log cabin that would be their new home. Now, life in the mountains wasn't for the faint of heart. Every day was a singular focus, and that was survival. The soil was so steep and rocky that a fella had to swing his hoe with one hand and hold on to a tree sapling with his other just to keep from falling. But still, the Ownby family managed to scratch out some taters, tobacco, and corn from the soil each year. But mostly, they just raised rocks. But besides food, perhaps the one thing that a man needed the most to survive in these rugged wilds was young'uns who could help out with the daily grind. And Thomas and Sarah had a whole passel of them, 9 in all. And among these children was a boy named Lim, who was born in the winter of 1889. Although Lim had been born with poor eyesight, he quickly learned to overcome the obstacle, and he worked just as hard as anyone else on the farm. And by the time he was 13 years old, he spent most of his days swinging an axe that was as tall as he was, helping his father build a larger cabin for the growing family along the singing waters of Jake's Creek. Lim learned from an early age that the forest provided much of the food that one needed to survive. Now, while flatland folks knew about chestnuts and wild berries, this mountain boy spent much of his time watching what the animals ate. After all, if it wouldn't hurt the family's milk cow, surely it wouldn't hurt them either. And it was nothing for Lim to gather up a mess of greens for supper. Greens that only mountaineers knew of: field mustard, crow's foot plant, poke shoots, and lamb's tongue. That's right. He became wise in the ways of the animals, the plants, and the forest, but not so much in school. You see, the closest school was 3 miles away, over on Meg's Mountain, and what little time Lim spent there was mostly just walking in one door and out the other. It was just too hard to worry about reading books when you were hungry. That's right, children grew up hard and fast back in those days, but many didn't, and in a world devoid of modern medicine, most of Lim's brothers and sisters never even made it out of childhood alive. Each and every year, Lim watched his father work, sun up to sundown. One minute, he was praying for the poor seeds that he planted in the flinty soil, and the next, he would curse them when they wouldn't grow, until that day came when the mountain finally broke the old man down, and he died. And a short year later, Lim's mama joined her husband on the other side of eternity. All they had left Lim was 44 acres of land that was steep as a cow's face and a pair of wore-out overalls. Just like that, the mountain boy was a man, and somehow he would have to find a way to make his own way in life. The virgin forest of the Smoky Mountains contains some of the finest hardwoods in all of America. And up until now, only a few hundred mountain families had called these forests home. Yet, by 1900, lumber companies began purchasing huge amounts of land near Lim's cabin. And soon, the sounds of axes and sawmills replaced the sound of the water flowing down Jake's Creek. And shortly after that, were the dynamite blast that echoed through the endless crags and hollers as a railroad was cut through the forest to carry out the valuable lumber. For the first time in Lim's life, the outside world had come to the mountains, and suddenly there were jobs available. Now, Lim had been swinging an axe since he was a small boy, so he was quickly hired by the Little River Lumber Company as a lumberjack. And what a lumberjack he was! Regularly cutting down 175 trees a day for $1.50. Like his father before him, Lim was a simple man, embracing the mountaineer lifestyle. He never owned farm machinery. Instead, he plowed with a mule, kept a milk cow, grew all his own vegetables, and hunted all his own meat. But above all else, he loved beekeeping. That's right, he had over 150 hives that produced the finest sourwood honey in all of the Smoky Mountains. Now, black bears loved that honey too, but Lim always kept a few good dogs around to help protect those bees, and none of them were tough as old Shep. Now, Shep was a mix of chow and shepherd, and he had a long scar across his face where once a bear had landed a good lick on him. And Shep was a good rattlesnake dog too. That's right, he had killed dozens of them, and even been bitten by the poisonous snakes many times. And each time, Lim would simply boil cockleburr leaves and soak a rag in them and wrap them around the snake bites to heal them. Occasionally, some city slicker would make their way up the mountain with the intention of trying to make a go at it and starting a new home. But it never seemed to work. Like that one time, a college-educated fella moved up beside Lim. But in less than a year, he had almost starved to death and even came down with a bad case of the warts. To hear Lim tell it, he was just too darn educated for his own good, and he didn't have nary a clue about scratching for a living. And he would have starved to death if Lim hadn't have felt sorry for him. And Lim even cured that fella's warts by telling him to steal a dish rag and rub it over his warts and then to hide it under a rock and never go back. And sure enough, by the time the dish rag rotted, the fella's warts were gone, and so was he from the mountains. So it was. Lim lived hidden away from the world at the back of beyond, so far in the woods that he had to go towards town just to go hunting for bears. That's right, Lim never traveled outside of the mountains or Tennessee, except for the one time when he walked to the North Carolina side of the mountain to buy a good dog from a fella. But change was in the air, and soon the outside world continued to inch closer and closer to the mountains. And then the government came knocking at Lim's door, wanting to turn over 500,000 acres of land into a national park. Now, most of that land was owned by lumber companies, who had stripped the mountains of all its natural resources and now had little need for the property. And they were more than happy to sell it to the U.S. government at taxpayers' expense. However, there were still thousands of families on both the Tennessee and North Carolina sides of the mountains, and many of them didn't want to abandon their farms or their homes. Yet, one by one, the families eventually sold their property and moved down to the towns in the valleys below to work at some factory job for the first time in their lives. And those who resisted were forced out by eminent domain. By 1934, only a handful of residents were still fighting the government and the court system to keep their homes. Most famously, the folks over in Cades Cove, or the Walker sisters. But also among this defiant group of mountaineers was Lim Ownby. Eventually, a compromise was negotiated when politicians and elected officials allowed a handful of mountaineers who were facing hardships to stay in their homes for the rest of their lives, on the condition that they sell the property to the government at half its market value. Because Lim was nearly blind, he was one of the few that were allowed to stay. But I'll tell you right now, he would never get over the bitterness that he felt towards the government for taking his land and enforcing strict regulations on him. He could no longer hunt for food. He couldn't cut firewood or grow a large garden. And anyone who violated the rules were evicted. Like Lim's uncle, Jim Carr, for shooting a bear that had raided his smokehouse. He was evicted. Another fella cut down a dying tree from his front yard, and he too was evicted. And as the decades rolled by, one by one, the residents with lifetime leases were either evicted or died off. All of the people in Cades Cove were gone. And by 1964, all of those famous Walker sisters were gone too. Suddenly, Lim Ownby was the last man on the mountain. Few people knew about him, but those who ventured to the abandoned town of Elkmont and made their way down a narrow gravel road that turned into a dirt path and then ended in Lim's front yard would be greeted by his dogs. And then they would find Lim sitting on his front porch, ready to sell him a jar of fresh honey. Now, Lim was a friendly fella, and he would just sit and talk about the old days with visitors. Unless they were from the government, then it was an entirely different story. Such as that one time in 1976, when two United States Supreme Court justices, who were on a retreat in Gatlinburg, decided that they would like to go visit the last mountaineer in the Smokies. But once they reached Lim's cabin and knocked on his door, as soon as they introduced themselves, he promptly told them he didn't have any use for any government man, told them to turn around and head back to Washington, D.C., and then he promptly closed his front door.
Born in 1889, half-blind boy but strong in spine, swung an axe from dawn to dark, carved his life in smoky bark, kept his bees and hunted game, worked for Little River name. When the world came taking land, Lim stood firm, the last to stand. Oh, Lim Ownby, mountain man, last to hold that smoky land, where Jake's Creek sings and wild winds blow farther than most folks dare to go.
Lim Ownby lived his entire life, all 94 years, in the same cabin that he had helped his father build when he was just a boy. There on Jake's Creek, he was kept company by his dogs and his bees. Although he was completely blind, he still managed to raise chickens, plant tomatoes and pumpkins, and fetch water from the spring that ran at the back of his property every day. He attributed his long good health to the bee honey that he kept, and he had it with every meal without ever taking any doctor's medicine. In his last years, he slipped on an icy patch on his front porch, and that landed him in the hospital in Knoxville for 10 days. During that time, he simply couldn't drink the water that was piped into the hospital, and someone had to literally drive back up to the Smoky Mountains and fetch a jug of Lim's spring water. By the time Lim died in 1984, he was the last person to live in the Smoky Mountains outside of Cades Cove. He was truly the last mountain man. Now, during my research for this story, I found an audio recording of Lim as part of the Library of Congress that was recorded when he was 91 years old, and talking about his life up in the Smoky Mountains. I'd like to share a part of it with you now.
So you've basically lived 91 years then, as of tomorrow, here at basically here at Elkmont, Jake's Creek.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You've lived here about all your life, though, is that right?
I was 2-year-old. I moved from the first cemetery down there. I was born there. There used to be a big white pine log house. My daddy owned that. He come here when I was 2-year-old. He said he might come here. Been here ever since.
Who were, can you remember something that happened to you when you were in school that just kind of stands out? Who were some of your teachers?
I never did go to school much.
Did you have eye problem when you were small, or did this come on later?
Which? Eye problem?
Yeah, you're able...
I was born that way. I'm a bird.
Was it, you weren't able to see too much then when you were...
Yeah, I couldn't see half as good as a man had good eyes. Back when I was younger, I could do a lot of work. And get around and go where I wanted to, but I never did have the eyesight other people have.
Well, I guess like all mountain people, the church was kind of a center focal point of the community. Mm-hmm. You remember anything about the revival times that you used to go to?
Yeah, they used to have some good meetings there.
Well, I understand that the Irish have tempers. That were the Ownbys Irish?
That's where we first started from.
Well, Uncle Lim, I was talking to a lady that's 90 years old, my neighbor, and I was walking yesterday through her yard, and she was out putting onions in the garden. Mm-hmm. And, of course, it's kind of a spring-like day yesterday, being in around 73 degrees, and today is equally pleasant. I've noticed you got your bees buzzing here in the house. You may have heard one or two of them swing by here while we're talking. It's a kind of typical spring. She started telling me, though, that she didn't think this warm weather's going to last too long. She started reminiscing the old snows. Do you remember anything about the big snows?
Yeah, I see them here at this place, 32 inches.
Well, you've got many memories, I know. The Depression, hard times, when we think of hard times, many of us think of the Depression. Did you have any other times that you would classify as hard times?
No. Not hardest times I've ever seen.
But you were able to do a lot of farming, and of course, like most mountain homes, I guess you managed to keep a certain amount of food. It might not have been a great variety, but I guess you always had food in the house.
Sure did. Always had a meal.
You had your own grist mill?
Oh, yeah, Pap had a mill.
How many grist mills were here in the Jakes Creek, Elkmont area?
Captain Nick had one, Levi had one, we had one, Dave on up here had one.
Well, with the grist mill, you were able to always have bread if you had a good field of corn.
We always made corn enough to do us about it. Never had to buy no corn much. We sold, I know the Papa sell 100 bushel. In order to sell 100 bushel one time, 40 cents a bushel. We made on these hills.
40 cents a bushel?
40 cents a bushel.
What a rare look at a time that is now long gone. I hope you enjoyed listening to Mr. Lim talk about the old days as much as I did. What a tremendous life he lived, from his father escaping to the mountains to avoid the Civil War, to their land being taken by the government to establish a national park, to becoming one of the few who were allowed to continue living in the park, and finally becoming the last man on the mountain. What an incredible man. Up next is one of the most powerful stories in the history of the Smoky Mountains, and it's got it all. Loyalty, honor, duty to country, and the ultimate betrayal. Coming in at number 8 on our countdown is the incredible life of Russell Gregory.
one of the first pioneers to settle Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains. He lived as one with the land until the American Civil War threatened to destroy his mountain oasis. One man would have to stand up and fight to save his family and his entire community. This is the true story of Russell Gregory. In many ways, Russell Gregory was one of the last true pioneers of the endless forest of Appalachia. Born in the mountains of North Carolina, less than 2 decades after the birth of the United States, the frontiersman grew up as wild and free as the animals who called these rugged wilds home. He learned to navigate the dense thickets of mountain laurel and rolling mist of the highlands with the same sure-footed grace as the Cherokees who he learned from. Russell made his home for a time at the top of Smoky Mountain, which towers at nearly a mile high, a massive sentinel in the wall of wilderness separating Tennessee and North Carolina. The Cherokees named this mountain Chistoyi, meaning the place of the rabbit. Unlike other peaks surrounded with thick forestry, Chistoyi was a bald. Its summit was swathed in lush, waving grasslands. It was here that Mr. Gregory built his 2-story log cabin with his own hands, using timber hewn from the lower forest and stones gathered from the wandering creeks. The cabin was fortified against the elements and wild intruders. It was more than a shelter, and for a while, he lived there in the pioneer spirit on the edge of the frontier, far from the white settlements down in the valley, and deep in what was considered the kingdom of the Cherokees. However, the landscape of Russell's life was about to change drastically. You see, in 1819, the United States negotiated the Treaty of Calhoun, which ended the Cherokee claims to the large mountain valley that laid just over the Tennessee side of Chistoyi. This fertile valley was named Cades Cove in honor of the Cherokee chief Cade, who once ruled here. But now that valley beckoned settlers with its rich soil and abundant wildlife. Russell Gregory was among the first 3 white men to move their families to this mountain oasis. They quickly built a grist mill by the stream that meandered through the valley, setting their sturdy plows to the earth to raise crops and cattle. And here, the Gregory family expanded in this secluded paradise, raising 4 boys and 4 girls in a home that was filled with love, discipline, and respect for the wilderness that provided for him. Russell was a loving father, especially when it came to his son Charles. Oh, he never strayed from his side. He taught him a deep reverence for God and for country. Together, they would embark on bear hunts that stretched out for weeks. And during this time, Russell taught Charles how to shoot with his trusty rifle he affectionately named Long Tom. The gun had been handmade many years ago, and each time its barrel was aimed, its target was sure to fall in a cloud of smoke and thunder. The gun was truly one of a kind because it had provided both meat and protection for the Gregory family, and it was the father's most valuable possession. As the years folded into decades, more families who were seeking the simpler pioneer way of life made their way into Cades Cove. Blacksmiths, carpenters, beekeepers, weavers, you name it. There were craftsmen of every trade. More and more log cabins were built, along with churches and schools. Each person played a vital role in the community. For Russell, he tended to the cattle, and during the growing season of each year, the fertile soil of the valley was needed for the vegetable crops. So, Russell would drive the cattle out of the cove and up the 5.5-mile trail of Smoky Mountain to graze on the grasslands that the mountaineer knew so well. The trip to the top of the mountain was so exhausting that Russell built a stone house at the top where he and Charles would live with the cattle until the crops were harvested down below in the valley. Only then would they drive the cattle back down. And so it was. The children grew and then spread out in the cove to start their own families. And by 1860, remarkably, there were nearly 700 people living in Cades Cove. For 40 years, they had lived in harmony with the land and the seasons. Yet, as the winds of change swept across America, whispers of a looming conflict began to seep into the valley. That's right, the war between the states, a storm of conflict and division, threatened to tear apart the very fabric of their peaceful existence. The valley that had once united pioneers under the banner of survival was now cleaved by ideology and loyalty, and soon every man would have to choose a side in a conflict that pitted brother against brother, and, as it would turn out, father against son, in the bloodiest conflict in American history.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today.
By 1861, Russell Gregory was now 66 years old, and although he was long in the tooth, the years of mountain living had taken a toll on his body. He walked with a severe limp and had little use of one arm. He was in no shape for a war, and like many people in Cades Cove, he was a staunch patriot who supported the Union cause. But there was also a strong sentiment of Confederate supporters, so much so that church services frequently became ground zero for heated arguments and division. Union supporters sat on one side of the church and Confederates on the other. Finally, all church services in the valley were canceled out of fear that there would be bloodshed during one of the meetings. Every able-bodied young man soon left the cove to fight for one side or the other. Even Russell's house was divided, with 2 of his sons fighting for the North and 2 fighting for the South. Charles, who had long been his father's pride and joy, had made the decision to fight for the Confederates, and soon he crossed over the North Carolina line to join Company F of Colonel Thomas's Legion. By 1862, Cades Cove was a community of old men, women, and children, and that put them in a very vulnerable position. The mountains that surrounded them soon became full of renegades, deserters from both armies, and bands of guerrillas who attacked mountaineers and farmers for supporting one side or the other. Soon, Cades Cove became the favorite target for these desperados, as they looted their crops, stole their cattle, dishonored their women, stole their guns, and burned their cabins. For 2 solid years, no one in the valley was safe from these attacks, and by the winter of 1863, folks barely had enough food to eat. Suspicion ran wild, as folks who were once neighbors and took care of one another now didn't know who to trust. Russell knew something had to be done, or else the community was going to be completely ransacked and abandoned. He had had enough. It was time for action. And by the spring of 1864, he organized all the men who were left in the cove, along with all the weapons they could scrounge. They developed a plan that they would follow the next time they were invaded. Each day, all the children would climb the surrounding hills to strategic locations where they could monitor the trails. And each time an intruder was located, the children would blow unique sounds from animal horns, signaling an impending attack to the valley below. Women would hide all the valuables underneath the floorboards and in the creek beds. Men would hide the cattle out in the forest, and then everyone would take cover hiding in a secret cave. And for a while, the plan worked, until the Confederates adapted and began conducting raids during the night, using the main path out of the cove to steal precious milk cows. Russell realized that hiding would no longer work. The women and the children would surely starve to death if the few menfolk that remained didn't fight. Next time they entered Cade's Cove, there would be hell to pay. By the winter of 1864, the Civil War had nearly tore apart the settlement. Nearly starving and out of options, Russell Gregory developed a plan to ambush the Confederates, who were crossing the North Carolina mountains and invading his homeland. The main path that led into the cove followed along Abrams Creek, and it was here that he would carry out his plan. On a cold, snowy night in December, Confederate Company F of Thomas's Legion once again attacked Cade's Cove. The group was comprised of fearless white men and Cherokees who ruthlessly fought side by side. And as they made their way into the cove, once again the children sounded their horns, and everyone ran to hide in the hills and caves. But this time, Russell left all the cattle as bait for the outlaws. Then, all of Russell's men made a frantic run for Abrams Creek, where they cut down a dozen trees, making it impassable for the soldiers to escape. And sure enough, an hour later, the sound of hooves could be heard approaching, as the Confederates had stolen every head of cattle and were leading them out of the cove. Russell commanded his men to flank both sides of Abrams Creek. They would attack in 2 waves at his command. As soon as the rebels were within range, the mountaineers opened fire. Each time one regiment fired, they quickly reloaded as the second wave unleashed a hailstorm of hot lead. Several soldiers were wounded, and in the confusion, Company F abandoned all the cattle and retreated for the hills. The next morning, Colonel Thomas was assessing the damage and trying to determine who had launched the sneak attack against them. And that's when one man stepped forward. That man was Charles Gregory. "Sir, I know who was responsible for this. I heard that rifle last night, and I know that sound anywhere. I learned how to shoot on that rifle, and that was the sound of Long Tom. That first bullet, it was fired by my father." That night, in the ultimate act of betrayal, Charles led the soldiers to his father's home under the cover of darkness. And there, they kicked his door in as his wife screamed in horror. Russell raised old Tom one last time, but before he could fire, he lost his balance and fell. The men drug him out of the cabin, where they took his own rifle, old Tom, and they shot Russell Gregory dead.
Born in Carolina wild, raised free as a mountain child, climbed Chistoye's windy crown, built his cabin looking down, first to settle Cade's Cove land, with Long Tom a rifle in his hand, till war brought fire to his door, and his own blood struck him down. Oh, Russell Gregory, standing tall, watched his world begin to fall, through war that split both kin and friend. He fought to hold his home till end, but blood ran cold on smoky ground when his son turned and gunned him down, and smoky winds still cry in pain.
Up next, we cross to the North Carolina side of the mountains for one of the most epic adventures to ever take place in the Smokies. Coming in at number 7 is Big Tom Wilson.
Nowadays, a lot of folks don't know it, but there was once a time in the 1800s when no one truly knew which mountain stood the tallest in Appalachia. Part of the reason was that the highest peaks were so remote, and no roads led to them. Plus, there were no tools that had been invented that could determine the exact height. This led to local folklores and debates on which was truly the crown jewel of the vast mountain chain that stretched across America into Canada. The result of all this uncertainty led to scientists and politicians both racing to discover the highest peaks so that they could name them after themselves. The last person anyone ever thought would determine the outcome of this debate was a mountain man. That's right. And this is the incredible true story of how Appalachia's highest peaks got their names. The chief actors in this story are two men. One was a noted scholar and scientist. The other was a gigantic hillsman, a mighty hunter of the bear and deer that for ages have roamed the vastness of the great Appalachian Mountains. To begin this story properly, we must go back nearly a decade before the Civil War. To most Americans at that time, the great virgin mountain masses of Tennessee and the Carolinas were sparsely populated by straggling descendants of the pioneers of the first Great Migration, and they were inaccessible except for a few steep and dangerous ox cart roads that sooner or later petered out among the highest hills into steeper and more dangerous game trails. No official surveys of the southern Appalachian Mountains had been undertaken by the government, and the altitude of the remote peaks of the Blue Ridge and the Great Smoky Mountains were unknown. There were many conflicting estimates, partly guesswork, partly based on inaccurate private surveys, and colored by local pride to be found in the fragmentary accounts that occasionally appeared in print. A certain peak in the Great Smoky Mountains, now known as Clingman's Dome, was generally believed to be the highest point in the Appalachian system, and its height was often declared to be upward of 8,000 feet. Most folks in New England, on the other hand, stoutly maintained that Mount Washington in the White Mountains was the loftiest peak in the Appalachians. About 1856, a committee in Congress was considering a request to officially name the Great Dome of the Smoky Mountains to Clingman's Dome in honor of Thomas Clingman, a longtime politician looking to leave a permanent mark on his legacy to be remembered long after he was gone. However, at the same time, a man named Elijah Mitchell was a professor of chemistry and geology in North Carolina, and oddly enough, he had once been the teacher of Thomas Clingman. The professor and his former pupil had a long-running debate between the two men on what was officially the tallest mountain. And just like that, a race between Clingman and Mitchell ensued in being the first to name Appalachia's tallest mountain in each man's honor. Now, Professor Mitchell, he was about 60 years old and a modest man. He had spent years as a surveyor, and he had spent many summers in the mountains on scientific explorations using barometric pressure devices to determine the altitude of mountain peaks. Despite his age, the professor decided to set out in June of 1857 with a small party of friends to the mountain summit located in the Black Mountains of North Carolina, which, 20 years before, he had first explored and declared to be the highest peak in all of Appalachia. It was his plan to look up some of the native guides and helpers that had traveled with him on that previous survey, and he would secure their sworn statements to be filed with other documentary proof with the Congressional Committee. Now, back in those days, it was a long and toilsome journey from Asheville to the summit of the suspected highest peak. The mountains were full of every type of wild animal, both known and unknown to mankind, and a man could easily get lost in these mountains and never be seen again. Yet, the professor was confident. Heck, he had set a rough stone marker there years ago at the exact spot that he had calculated to be the highest point of land east of the Rocky Mountains. So Professor Mitchell and his group struck out, and within a few days they reached the top. However, the professor decided to dismiss his companions and continue his journey alone down into the deep valley on the Yancey side of the Great Ridge, where he hoped to secure an affidavit from an old trapper and guide by the name of Big Tom Wilson. He knew he could count on the help from Big Tom and the loyal mountaineers that had come to know and love the professor as the years had gone by. Now, no one knew it at the time, but that parting with his friends at the top of the Black Dome was the last time that Professor Mitchell would ever be seen alive. When he hadn't returned by the third day, his family became alarmed, and the next day they sent out a small search party to find him. But soon it was learned that he never reached the home of Big Tom, and none of the mountain folks had ever seen or heard from him. A large search party was quickly formed, and a day and night manhunt commenced, combing one after another of the ridges and the ravines with dogs and lanterns, and they were keeping in touch with each other by prearranged gunshot signals. Several days passed, however, without a single trace of the professor. On the 11th day of the search, word finally made it to Big Tom that the professor was lost deep in the mountains and nobody could find him. Big Tom arranged a small group of mountain men to join the search. Now, you have to keep in mind that Big Tom was a giant of a man, a stranger to fear, and familiar with every mile of the dark wilderness of the Black Mountains. He was a legendary bear hunter who had killed 114 bears. Big Tom possessed a remarkable degree and almost uncanny power that few men outside of the Indians had ever acquired in reading the signs of man or beast in the woods. The veteran hunter and his group of seasoned mountain men set out to the top of the dome where the professor was last seen, and they gathered the only known details. The professor had intended to take the beach nursery trail to the foot of the mountain. Big Tom and his men set out in a single file line, with the giant man in the lead. He had barely gone a half a mile when his eye caught something significant that all the other parties had missed. "Look, boys," he shouted. "Right here's where the man missed the trail. Instead of bearing to the left like he ought, he turned down towards Piney Ridge, and right there, in that minute, he was lost, and bad lost." Sure enough, as they pressed on down the right-hand trail, which was probably only a bear path, here and there appeared the faint but still recognizable tracks of a man, headed toward the desolate waste under the frowning tops of the twin peaks known as the Black Brother Mountains. "He couldn't have been making no time in here, boys," Big Tom declared half an hour later as the going grew worse and more dangerous. "See how he had to tromp down that bush right there and fight through the laurel? And here's a piece of his torn-out coat." 2 miles more they pushed on, slow, wearisome miles, even for the sturdy mountaineers. For the aged professor, it must have been a grilling experience. "Here's where Dark overtook him. Look where he twisted that pine knot out of that old log, made himself a torch. And here's a coal that dropped from the torch when he crossed this rock." 2 more miles through tangled briars, over jagged ledges, and down the boulder-strewn bed of Little Creek. "Course, by this time, he knowed he was lost," Big Tom said. "But he figured this creek would take him down to Cane River, which it naturally would, only it's a terrible way to get there." Suddenly, the men's ears caught the distant roar of falling water from far below. "Listen, boys, there's a falls ahead of us. Keep your eyes peeled, fellas." A few hundred yards more and the roar grew louder. They were at the very top of the ledge. "Look, boys," Big Tom sang out. "He was trying to get around to the right of this place at night, boys. So he grabbed a hold of this little sapling, and his foot slipped on this rock. The sapling broke right off in his hand. Boys, that poor old man fell right over them falls. We'll find him down there just as sure as the world." Climbing down over the rocks and through the undergrowth, the men at last reached the foot of the cliff, over which tumbled a foaming cascade of water, approximately 20 feet high. At its foot was a deep, dark, jug-shaped pool of swirling foam, 10 to 12 feet across. Even the strongest swimmer couldn't have kept afloat in that mad little whirlpool. At first, they couldn't see anything in the churning water, but finally, Big Tom made out a dark object underneath the surface, lying across a sunken birch log. that had long ago fallen into the pool. And in the bottom of that sunless gorge, they lifted the body of Professor Mitchell from its watery tomb. Sadly, and with much labor, they carried him back up the long miles and they delivered him to his friends waiting at the top. Big Tom and his mountaineers urged them to lay the professor at rest there on top of the mountain. However, the professor's friends took his body back to Asheville and buried him in the cemetery. So, with the professor dead and his claim of the tallest mountain being unproven, the United States Congress officially named Clingman's Dome the tallest mountain in Appalachia. And it appeared that the student had indeed outsmarted his professor after all. However, several years later, when the government finally surveyed the mountain the professor died trying to prove was the tallest, they did in fact confirm that it was taller than Clingman's Dome by 41 feet. The professor had been right all along. His family dug up his bones in Asheville, and they buried him at the top of the mountain. And the U.S. government officially named the tallest mountain in Appalachia, Mount Mitchell, in honor of Professor Mitchell. Now, Big Tom Wilson, he would live another 50 years in those mountains, living free among the wild animals in the wilderness. When he finally passed away in 1908, the United States named the mountain next to Mount Mitchell Big Tom Mountain, ensuring that both the professor and Big Tom's legacy will live on forever in the Appalachian Mountains.
Perhaps no one is more legendary on the Tennessee side of the Smoky Mountains than the one, the only, Black Bill Walker. Coming in at number 6 is his incredible true story.
The legend of Black Bill? No. Well, it can't be told without talking about Old Death.
Black Bill Walker was one of the most colorful and legendary men to ever hail from the Great Smoky Mountains during the 1800s. One of the last true pioneers who feared neither man nor beast, and he lived his unique life on his own terms. This is his incredible true story. Our story begins in 1838 in the Great Smoky Mountains in a small valley known as Tuckaleechee Cove. It's here where a scrappy baby boy named William Walker was born into this world. Affectionately called Bill, the boy was born with a pioneer's spirit, and some say that he could even lift a rifle to his shoulder before he could even walk. It came natural for the young lad. After all, his father was John Walker, a brawny mountaineer who had once put aside his career as a fiery circuit-riding preacher of the gospel just long enough to fight in the American Revolution, where he was among one of the over-mountain men who gave those redcoats a whipping at the Battle of Kings Mountain, a resounding victory that turned the tide of the war in America's favor. So, it should be no surprise that John's son, Bill, would grow up just like his father, a fiercely independent, Bible and gun-toting mountaineer who still had the pure blood of his Scottish ancestors flowing through his veins. As a boy, Bill loved to roam the mountains. There was nothing about the ways of those wild critters that the youngster didn't carefully study until he knew their every movement and tendency. The curious youngster spent his childhood crisscrossing the summit of Thunderhead Mountain, back and forth between North Carolina and Tennessee. He tracked the deer and he knew their bedding spots. He studied the claw marks left behind by foraging bears, and he could tell how fresh a trail was just by the way the leaves had been turned. Bill knew the language of the forest. He studied the shape and the direction of the clouds and could tell just by the smell of the air whether a storm was brewing just 2 ridges away or if a dry spell was coming.
He knew the flicker of a squirrel's tail or the sudden stillness of the birds. They could tell Bill more about the weather than any flatlander with an almanac could ever predict. He'd watch the fall breeze ripple through the leaves of a yellow poplar tree and know whether the winter would be bitter or mild. He studied how early the dogwoods bloomed or how thick the acorns fell to predict the kind of season that was ahead. Simply put, the mountains were his classroom. Its animals, trees, and plants were his teacher, and he was their master student. And before long, Bill Walker had become as much a part of the wilderness as the wilderness itself. By the time he was 21 years old, Bill had grown into a mountain of a man, standing well over 6 feet 2 inches tall in his socks and weighing in at 190 pounds of hard, lean muscle. He looked every bit of the part of one of the prophets from the Old Testament and the Bible. He had developed a reputation as one of the best hunters in this section of the mountains, and locals even referred to him as the champion animal tracker of Tuckalich. Well, that year, Bill married a 20-year-old woman named Nancy Kaler, and as was the custom of those days, they started their marriage living in the honeymoon cabin located near Nancy's family's homestead in Tuckalich Cove. But before long, Bill began to yearn for more space and freedom. So, in 1859, he and his new bride bid farewell to their families and loaded all their earthly possessions on a mule and set out towards Thunderhead Mountain. The couple followed the crystal stream known as the Little River that flowed through Tuckalich upstream until it came upon a foaming rapids where 3 smaller branches of the river converged. Then they carried on, following the middle section of the river higher and higher as the earth rose into the great Smoky Mountains, before finally coming to a vast, level valley. Bill looked out and gazed at the complete wilderness that laid at the base of Fodderstack Mountain, and he knew that this was where they belonged. And here, in the fertile bottomlands, along the Little River's middle prong, Bill and Nancy Walker became the first settlers to ever make this isolated land their home. Bill immediately built a small cabin for his wife, and before long, the two were raising their own children. Now, the bottomlands that laid in the middle between the 3 branches of the river was now Bill Walker's homestead. A staggering 5,000 acres of land, nearly 8 square miles of fertile land and virgin woodlands. And Bill spent endless hours in the forest, hunting bear and deer. And when he was back at the homestead, he tended to over 100 hives of bees he kept in hollowed-out logs called bee gums. He raised a large vegetable garden. He fished, built a grist mill for grinding corn, and he was even a master barrel maker who made watertight oak barrels to keep his whiskey in. The crafty mountaineer mined ore and built a small blast furnace he used as a blacksmith shop where he made tools, plows, and even gun barrels. Bill Walker was truly independent, and there wasn't nary a thing he couldn't build with his own 2 hands. Now, as for Bill's gun, it was one that had been passed down to him by his father, the same flintlock that had been used in the American Revolution, a 6-foot-long Kentucky long rifle that weighed over 20 pounds and could shoot a 2-ounce ball with pinpoint accuracy at 200 yards. And when this gun was pressed against Bill's shoulder, anything it was aimed at was sure to fall. So much so that Bill named the gun Old Death, since he had harvested hundreds of deer and bear with it. Locals who went on bear hunts with Bill told legendary tales of his hunting prowess, including one time when he came upon a group of 20 bear gorging on a bounty of chestnuts on the forest floor. after a storm had rolled through the night before. Within 24 hours, Bill had single-handedly tracked and killed 6 bear, which was an unheard-of record. Another time, Bill tracked a bear into a small cave where he couldn't fit Old Death into the mouth of the cave. And instead, he went in armed with only a short, sharpened hickory spear and his knife. And a few minutes later, after all hell broke loose, when he crawled out of the cave, there on his back was the bear. And he soon made a fine rug out of the hide. Soon folks began referring to him as Black Bill Walker. There was no animal that he feared, and no risk he wouldn't take during a hunt. Now, Bill was also known as an early conservationist. Now, he cherished the virgin forest on his property, and he watched with sadness and concern as logging companies bought up all the land in the Smoky Mountains and began scalping it of its riches. For decades, the trees fell. Railroad tracks were laid to haul the gigantic chestnuts out of the forest, some of which were nearly 1,000 years old. And yet, as the saws rang out nonstop across the mountains, year after year, Bill watched as the mountains became mere skeletons of their former glory, stripped of their trees. And now, without the root systems, massive erosion ravaged the mountainsides. Many natural springs disappeared or were forever altered. And worst of all of the animals of the forest were suddenly without their primary sources of food, and the wildlife population was decimated. And Bill was outraged by the destruction of the forest that he loved so much, and he refused to sell his property to the timber companies, no matter how much money they offered him. And soon, Bill's property was one of the only places left in the mighty Smoky Mountains that was still an untouched virgin forest. Yet, he vowed to fight to keep it that way, no matter what. Now, as much as Bill was known as a hunter and a conservationist, he was equally known for his quirky, strong religious views. And his beliefs and interpretations of the Bible are as much a part of this story as his adventures with his trusty rifle, Old Death. You see, Bill had grown up in a religious home, and despite his lack of a formal education, his father had taught him how to read as he and the boys sat night after night, reading endless chapters of the Bible together. Bill could quote complete books of the Bible from memory and enjoyed nothing more than discussing the prophets from the Old Testament. Men like Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, or David and his legendary victory against the giant named Goliath, or even Solomon, the wisest man who had ever lived. These men were Bill's heroes. And the more and more he thought about it, there was one thing that all of these great men had in common. They all had multiple wives and had been richly blessed by the Lord. And even though Bill and Nancy had been married and even had 7 children of their own, following the lifestyle of the great prophets of old, the husband and wife soon brought another woman into their home named Mary Moore, who Bill took as a common-law wife, and as the years went by, 7 more children were born. Nancy even served as a midwife and assisted in taking care of the new mother and her children, apparently all living in harmony together before Bill built Mary a cabin on the opposite side of the middle prong of the Little River. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. 14 children by 2 women, all living happily together? How is that even possible? Well, my friend, hold on just a second, because old Bill, he wasn't done just yet. That's right. Several years later, Nancy, Mary, and Bill brought in another woman into the home, Molly Stinnett, who would soon give birth to another 12 children. That's right, a staggering 26 children now living in the valley that the locals referred to as Walker Valley.
Hey guys, JD Phillips, and we are here in the Great Smoky Mountains on the Tennessee side, where I'm standing on the banks of the middle prong of the Little River, where Black Bill Walker built his cabin in 1859, and where he and his 3 wives raised a small army of children. And this became the thriving community of Walker Valley. Now, after the government bought this place and turned it into a national park, they renamed it to Tremont. And sadly today, there's not even a single sign to suggest that Black Bill Walker once was here, or the thriving community of Walker Valley was even here.
Now, don't get me wrong. Bill Walker was a highly respected man throughout this section of the mountains. He became a vocal leader in the fight against deforestation. He was the only property owner in the mountains who had the guts to refuse to sell to those timber barons. He donated land to build the first schoolhouse and even a teacher's cottage in the area. And then he built 3 grist mills for the community. He donated money to those in need, and he never turned a soul who was in need away. And let's not forget, he took care of all of his children who loved him dearly. And even in his 70s, he was as healthy as a young man. One newspaper reporter stated that at the age of 78, Black Bill Walker could jump in the air and click his heels together twice before his feet hit the ground. Now, but alas, Father Time is undefeated and makes no exceptions for mortal man in the end. And by 1917, Black Bill Walker suffered a severe stroke where for the next 2 years, 5 of his daughters lovingly cared for their father until he died just 2 years later at the age of 81.
Hey guys, JD Phillips here, and we are in Townsend, Tennessee at Bethel Baptist Church, where Bill Walker is laid to rest here. Now, although Bill had spent his entire life trying to keep those timber companies off of his land, well, when he died, all of his property was inherited by the 5 daughters of his that took care of him during his final years of life. And sadly, just a few years after his death, they gave in and sold all of Bill Walker's land to the timber companies, where the last virgin forest in the Great Smoky Mountains was scalped of its riches. After Bill Walker passed away, his trusty rifle, Old Death, was sold at an auction to a New York City businessman. Now, the businessman bought the rifle because when he was a boy, he had actually spent the night at Bill Walker's cabin as a snowstorm blew through Walker Valley. And in true mountaineer fashion, Bill Walker fed him and his mother, and as they sat in front of the fireplace that night, he told that city boy all the stories of his thrilling adventures of hunting as Old Death hung above the fireplace. Well, that boy never forgot that. And so in the 1920s, when he saw that gun at auction, he bought it, where it would remain in his family for the next 100 years until finally, in 2023, Bill Walker's Old Death returned home to the Great Smoky Mountains.
Black Bill Walker was one of the most colorful men to ever live in the Great Smoky Mountains. From his thrilling hunting adventures with his 6-foot gun, affectionately named Old Death, to fathering an astounding 26 children by 3 wives, all while living in one of the last virgin forests in the Great Smoky Mountains. Up next is one of the bravest women to ever call the Smoky Mountains home. Her incredible true story will leave you in awe. At number 5 on our countdown is Lydia Whaley. She was widowed and childless before her 25th birthday and forced to survive the Civil War alone in the Smoky Mountains. Prepare yourself for the incredible true story of Lydia Whaley. Our story begins in 1840 in a small hidden valley tucked away on the Tennessee side of the mighty Smoky Mountains. White settlers had only arrived just a few decades earlier and found this dense forest thick with sugar maple trees. The land itself was rich and fertile and well suited for growing corn,
with a crystal clear creek that wound its way straight through the heart of the valley like a silver ribbon. The families who settled here named this enchanted place the Sugarlands. For each spring, they tapped the maples and boiled down the sap to make syrup and sugar, drawing sweetness from the wilderness itself. It was here that a little girl named Lydia Kerr was born and raised, one of 10 children in a hard-working mountain household. Her father was a first-generation Scottish American and a deeply religious man who read aloud from the Bible to his children each night by the firelight. Most mountaineers of the era had little use for book learning, mostly because they believed that children were meant to serve as unpaid farmhands. But Lydia's father thought differently. He believed that education, it was a gift from God, and he proved it by donating land to build the first school in the Sugarlands. There, Lydia and her brothers and sisters learned arithmetic and writing from traveling teachers with their sheepskins from faraway colleges who rode in on horseback from the flatlands. And because the schoolhouse stood on the family's own farm, those youngins could still tend to their daily chores before and after those lessons. From an early age, it was plain that Lydia possessed a keen and curious mind. She spent many of her days working alongside her father in his blacksmith shop, where she learned the secrets of fire and iron. She often followed him on bear hunts and learned to shoot as steady as any boy could. And by the age of 12, she could make animal traps and fish snares using little more than chestnut wood and her own ingenuity. Her father taught her how to build all sorts of useful contraptions, mouse traps, flour sifters, and hand tools. He also taught her the patient craft of tanning hides and sewing leather into saddlebags and harnesses, stitching them together with hair pulled from a horse's tail. Lydia's mother was also a first-generation American, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had carried the old world skills across the ocean and into the mountains. From her, Lydia learned how to spin wool and cotton into beautiful quilts and coats, which were dyed in bright, lasting colors by soaking the cloth in the juices of roots and wild berries. Her mother also taught her how to weave baskets by bending slender strips of willow into intricate designs. Between her parents, Lydia was prepared in every way, spiritually by faith and physically by skill. Simply put, there was very little in this world that Lydia couldn't do for herself. By 1860, the mountain girl was 19 years old and had fallen in love with a young man named John Whaley. And although John was only 17, he already had a reputation as a fearless hunter and a skilled blacksmith. At just 15 years of age, he had survived a brutal attack from a black bear, during which the animal broke John's neck in the struggle. Somehow, John lived through the ordeal and miraculously was neither killed or permanently paralyzed. However, because of the injury, he would never again be able to turn his head fully straight, and for the rest of his life, he walked with his face held slightly to the right. Still, the couple proved to be a perfect match for one another, and in the winter of 1860, they said their vows and were stitched together as one. Then John built a small cabin for his new bride on the banks of Holly Creek, just over the mountain from Lydia's childhood farm, in a place called Gatlinburg. Now, back in those days, folks didn't waste time on honeymoon nonsense. Instead, they got straight down to the business of raising a family. And by 1864, Lydia and John had brought a baby boy and a baby girl into this world. But the winds of change were sweeping across America, and before long, news of a war had made its way over the mountains. That's right, there was no place immune from the Civil War, and the mountaineers of East Tennessee, well, they were bitterly divided over the conflict. Even those that tried to remain neutral often saw their farms raided by both Union and Confederate troops. John watched as neighbors had their horses stolen and their hogs slaughtered by a Confederate band of guerrillas made up of Cherokee fighters and white men who fought side by side and were known as Thomas's Legion, and they were terrorizing the highlands. John had seen enough, and he knew he had to act before his family became their next victims. And so, John Whaley joined the Union Army. For Lydia, although the young wife didn't know it, her world was about to take a devastating turn and would never be the same again. You see, no sooner than her husband took up arms for the Bluecoats, John and Lydia's firstborn son, he took sick with a fever in August of 1864 and tragically died. And no sooner than the devastated mother had finished digging a grave and burying her only son, 3 weeks later, while trying to rescue a captured soldier at nearby Fort Harry's Ford, her husband John was shot and killed. The next day, John was carried back by wagon to Lydia, where she lovingly bathed his earthly body and then buried him next to their son, standing there on a hill with her 1-year-old daughter cradled in her arms. Lydia opened her Bible and read from Psalms 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Devastated, Lydia gently placed a field stone over the fresh dirt and bid her husband goodbye, completely unaware that she was pregnant with his unborn child. The next year was filled with many dark days. Soldiers from both sides stole Lydia's horse, killed her chickens, and often burst into her cabin at gunpoint, demanding whatever food she had managed to save. The frightened young mother learned to hide her milk cow high on the mountainside above her home and to tuck potatoes beneath the floorboards where prying eyes might not think to look. Still, she refused to give in to despair. Taking up John's old rifle, Lydia began hunting down her own meat and setting fish traps along the creek, hauling her catch into the loft and covering it with straw whenever rumors of soldiers moving through the valley reached her ears. Most of her nights were spent listening for bootstraps on the trail and praying that the latch on her door wouldn't be lifted before morning. 5 months later, in the heart of a bitter snowstorm in February of 1865, with no midwife to help her, Lydia brought a baby girl into the world by the light of the hearth fire, and this child would grow up never knowing her father's face or the sound of his voice, only the stories that her mother would one day tell her. Lydia wrapped the newborn in a faded quilt and wept for the fragile life that she now had to protect. Mercifully, 3 months later, the Civil War finally came grinding to an end. The guns fell silent, and the soldiers drifted away from the mountains, leaving behind empty fields, broken homes, and a valley scarred by hunger and fear. For Lydia, this newfound peace didn't mean rest. Instead, it meant starting over with 2 small children, a ruined farm, and nothing but her own strength and faith to guide her forward. Now, most folks assume that Lydia would just find herself a new husband. After all, she was just 25 years old, and most women needed a man to survive back in those days. But not Lydia. You see, it almost seemed that destiny had been preparing her for this moment for all her life. And I can tell you right now that she didn't back down. She was bound and determined to make it on her own. And what happens next would make Lydia Whaley one of the most legendary women in American history. That's right. During the decades that followed the war between the states, Lydia raised both of her daughters to adulthood by earning money any way she could. She sold honey from her beehives, served as a midwife, and delivered countless babies, and made medicines for all manner of ailments from herbs, bark, and roots that she gathered in the forest. She treated colds with pennyroyal tea. She cured stomach ulcers and mouth sores with a drink made from yellow root, and she used bone-set tea to reduce fever. No one had money, so instead they paid her with apples and sacks of cornmeal. And each time an elderly person passed away in Gatlinburg, it was Lydia whom the community called to lay out the dead and to prepare them for the burial. And many times it was Lydia herself who preached the funeral, for she knew the Bible from cover to cover. The mountain woman tended to all of her own animals and raised all her own food. She tanned leather, which she used to make her children's shoes. She planted cotton each year and raised sheep that she would use to create her children's clothing. Lydia's attention to detail was second to none, and soon she caught the attention of a local store owner who began selling her handcrafted baskets. The businessman even began taking custom suit orders from men who lived in the community, where Lydia would pick up the orders and hand-make the suits. She'd shear and card the wool before spinning and dyeing it, and then weaving it into fabric. Lydia's fine wool jackets and pants sold for 50 cents, and made-to-order cotton shirts sold for as much as 25 cents. She had a habit of telling her daughters that they better be good to the sheep on the farm, because those animals were in fact wearing the girls' winter coats. By 1900, the old woman that lived along the banks of Holly Creek was known to everyone as Aunt Litty. She was 60 years old now, and still living in the same rough-hewn cabin that John had built for her so many decades before. Each month, she received an $8 pension from the United States government for her husband's service in the war, a small sum that helped her buy coffee and salt each time she made the long walk down the mountain to sell her handmade baskets. Otherwise, she lived much as she always had, tending to a small garden, keeping a few chickens, and drawing water from the creek that sang past her door. But below her humble cabin, a different world was rising. The once forgotten settlement of Gatlinburg had begun to draw the eye of outsiders. Word had spread of the cool mountain air, the clear streams, and the misty ridges that glowed purple at sundown. Soon, hotels and boarding houses dotted the valley floor, and each summer brought more and more visitors riding in by wagon and rail, eager to escape the heat of the lowlands. Now, where the cornfields and the pastures once laid, there were porches lined with rocking chairs and guests dressed in fine clothing, marveling at the scenery that the mountain families had known all their lives. To Aunt Litty, the valley no longer belonged to the birds and the wind. Instead, all she could hear was the rumble of wagons, the distant talk of strangers, and sometimes the motor of an automobile echoing off the ridges. The world beyond her doorstep was pressing closer each year, and the place that had once only belonged to pioneers like her was slowly becoming a destination for tourists. Even with all the change, Aunt Litty remained true to her mountain roots. Her cabin never had electricity or running water, and she had never had the need for a city doctor her entire life. Even when she was 78 years old and bitten on the hand by a copperhead snake while collecting eggs, causing her arm to swell terribly. Undaunted, she simply wrapped the wound in warm chicken guts, and within a couple days, all of the swelling was gone. Whenever she wasn't weaving baskets or spinning wool, she spent all of her time studying and memorizing the same Bible that her grandfather had brought from Scotland. And like her father, Aunt Litty saw the value in education, and as she watched Gatlinburg grow, she foresaw the need for better access for the mountain children. In her mind, no longer would the one-room schoolhouse prepare them for this changing world. So, Aunt Litty began writing letters to a respected women's educational group in Virginia, lobbying them for a modern school to be built in Gatlinburg. And in 1912, her efforts became a reality when a brand new school was built that provided expanded educational courses and even health care access to all the local children. The school went far beyond reading and writing and also taught traditional mountain crafts to the children. And although she was well into her 70s, Aunt Lydia taught basket making, wool spinning, and craft making to all the children at the school. She was truly one of the last living links to a bygone era in America's rich history.
In the sugar lands where the maples grew, by a silver creek and a sky so blue, a mountain girl with a steady hand was raised on faith in a rugged land. Fire and iron, needle and thread, books and the Bible by candlelight read. Oh, sweet Lydia, mountain strong, faced her sorrow and carried on. From war-torn days to peaceful ground, she held her place. When the world turned round, she loved a boy named John Whaley, bare-scarred neck, but brave as could be. Built her cabin by Holly Creek, two little babies in a winter's week. Then drums of war came one day, came and swept her world away. Oh, sweet Lydia, mountain strong, faced her sorrow and carried on. From war-torn days to peaceful ground, she held her place. When the world turned round.
On a cold morning in 1926, at 86 years old, Aunt Lydia passed away peacefully in the small cabin that she had lived in her entire life. Towards the end of her life, she had become a legend among the folks who flocked to Gatlinburg and made the pilgrimage to her cabin to meet her and purchase her handmade baskets. It's said that she sold over 5,000 of them and gave all the money to her two daughters to help them buy farms of their own. Today, Aunt Lydia's baskets can be found in museums all across the southern Appalachians, and they're centerpieces in collections in many universities and command top dollar whenever one of them finds its way to an auction. So there you go, my friends. Now you know the rest of the story of Aunt Litty, a woman whose life was shaped by loss, faith, and overcoming. She truly was someone who asked very little of this world, but she gave it everything she had. Today, most folks have completely forgotten about her. But if you ever find yourself in Gatlinburg, I encourage you to drive just a little bit off the beaten path and take Ski Mountain Road that runs towards the ski resort up in Ober-Gatlinburg. And down at the base of the mountain, there's a small creek that once ran behind Aunt Lydia's cabin, and it still runs today. And although her cabin was torn down many years ago, if you listen close enough, you can still feel her spirit. To become a legend in the Smokies, a man needed to be cunning and witty and supremely skilled. And perhaps no one possessed more of these qualities than the man who hailed from Elkmont, Tennessee. Coming in at number 4 is none other than Levi Trenum.
Long before the Smoky Mountains ever became a national park, there was a wild mountain man who wrestled bears, outlived the timber barons, and watched as his wilderness turned into a playground for the rich. This is the incredible true story of Levi Trenum.
Up on Jake's Creek where the cold water ran, lived a hard-headed hunter named Levi Trenum. Raised on cornbread and bear meat stew, talked to the mountains like old friends do.
Our story begins in 1833 in a tiny mountain hamlet tucked beneath the shadow of LeConte Mountain, along the banks of the Little Pigeon River. It had been less than 20 years since the Ogle family made their way over the mountains from South Carolina to call this little oasis their new home, which they named White Oak Flats. It was here that a boy named Robert Trenum was born and raised. Now, Robert was your typical mountain boy. From the time he was big enough to tote a bucket, he was hauling water from the creek and carrying kindling from the forest floor. His father taught him early on how to set snares along those bear trails and how to read the weather by the way the clouds clung to LeConte's Peak. The boy grew up barefooted and wild and knew the sound of every bird and where to find the sweetest berries in the woods. Now, by the time Robert was a teen, he could swing an axe and shoot straight as any full-grown man. And like so many folks during this era, by the time he was 17, he found himself a good woman and got married, ready to start their own family. After all, back in those days, you had to get an early start if you planned on living long enough to see your children grow up, since the average lifespan of a mountaineer was barely more than 40 years. But things in White Oak Flats were rapidly changing. What had once been a place with a handful of families was now by 1850 full of nearly 300 people. Heck, they even had a postmaster who changed the name to Gatlinburg. Well, that was the final straw for Robert. He took his new bride and loaded his wagon with all their earthly possessions and struck out up the side of the mighty Smoky Mountains before heading west along Fighting Gap Creek for several more grueling miles, and then climbing even higher until he was finally nearly 10 miles away from his closest neighbor. And there, on the banks of Jake's Creek, Robert Trenum built his new wife a small log cabin. The young couple set about their lives, living in blissful solitude, and soon they brought a passel of young'uns into this untamed world, 10 in all. The oldest of the children was a boy named Levi, who was born in 1852. And, as the old saying goes, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. And when it came to Levi, he was the spitting image of his father, feisty, stubborn, and notoriously independent, all of the perfect qualities of a mountaineer. Levi was a constant companion to his pa, traveling all over the hills and crags, trapping animals, and as plentiful as wild game was, so were the fish. Jake's Creek was so full of trout that Levi could simply stick his bare hands in the water and yank out as many fish as he fancied. The family kept bees, raised hogs and chickens, and kept a beautiful vegetable garden. And over the years, Robert Trenum slowly acquired thousands of acres of the virgin forest that was towering with chestnuts, oaks, and yellow poplar trees. And he and Levi even built a grist mill on the creek, and soon a sawmill. That's right. In a world absent of all modern conveniences, the Trenums were completely self-sufficient, and they only made the journey down the mountain a couple of times a year to sell their animal furs or honey. Like his father, Levi grew up fearless and strong, and by the time he was a teen, he was already a bear hunting legend and had become a master trapper. Folks in Sevier County told countless stories of his hunting adventures with other Smoky Mountain legends such as Uncle Sammy Birchfield, Ben Pardon, and Black Bill Walker. It was said that they killed over 300 bears together, and many times in fantastic battles of hand-to-hand combat, such as the winter of 1881, when Levi and Ben came upon a small cave that had bear tracks at the entrance, where the animals had been sneaking out to get a drink of water from a nearby creek. The hole was too small to fit their long flintlock rifles in, so a flip of a coin decided which man would go into the cavern first. And unfortunately for Ben, he won the honors. So Levi waited at the mouth of the cave as his partner slid through the small opening on his belly into the blackness. Moments later, a thunderous roar came from within the cave that sent the birds in the nearby trees scattering in the air. Ben had found that bear all right, and now the fight was on. The human screams were just as loud as the bear's mighty roar. And nearly a half hour later, Ben Pardon finally came slowly crawling out of the mouth of that cave, with several deep tears in his flesh, and barely a shred of his tattered clothing left, before collapsing on the ground. Levi, in typical mountaineer humor, took a good look at his friend and cracked, "Well, Ben, I hate to ask you, but after you finish resting up, are you going back in to get my bear?" To which his friend replied, "Your bear, hell! Go in and get your own damn bear." Another time, a bear had been terrorizing Levi's hogs on the rear of his property, so he set up a trap and waited. The next morning, he heard a terrible roar and a ruckus from all his pigs, and he ran out of that cabin so fast that he had left his gun. But there it was, all right. The bear was caught in a trap, but somehow had still managed to snatch a piglet, which he was now making his lunch. Now, Levi thought of all the pigs he had lost because of that dad-blasted varmint, and he was so mad that he reached down to find whatever weapon he could, which just so happened to be a pine knot. And then he smacked that bear right in the nose. The bear dropped that pig, and the fight was on. The wild animal swung over and over, trying to slap that pine knot out of Levi's hand. But Levi was ducking and dodging, and every time there was an opening, he'd land another haymaker on the bear. Finally, one vicious uppercut to the beast's jaw knocked him out cold. Now, whenever Levi wasn't battling bears, he continued the pioneer lifestyle that his father had taught him, running a grist mill, tending bees, and in his spare time, raising a crop of young'uns with his faithful wife. But, as the old saying goes, nothing lasts forever. And by 1900, a wealthy Pennsylvania industrialist named Colonel W.B. Townsend began buying up huge tracts of land, tens of thousands of acres of the Smoky Mountains, and then he set up operations to harvest the virgin forest. Nearly overnight, Levi's secluded paradise on Jake's Creek turned into a lumber company called Elkmont. Then, a sawmill was set up 18 miles away in Tuckaleechee, and then a railroad that connected the two towns was cut through the forest. And soon, they started bringing train loads of sightseeing wealthy elites from nearby Knoxville. Colonel Townsend named this massive operation the Little River Timber and Railroad Companies. And soon, it was the largest hardwood timber company in the eastern United States. As sad as it was with all of the deconstruction of the forest, most mountaineers simply didn't have the means to fight for their ancestral homes. So, they just simply sold their land to the timber barons and moved down to flatland country. Two of the only men to hold out and refuse to sell their land was Black Bill Walker and Levi Trenum. But no matter how they tried to hold on to their own way of life, soon rich men from Knoxville bought up a bunch of land along Jake's Creek and began building summer cottages and even a massive playground for the rich called the Wonderland Hotel. Suddenly, Levi's home was a tourist destination for society's powerful and elite. As much as Levi disliked all the changes, he had sense enough to know that grudges didn't put meat in the smokehouse. So when the city folks came wandering up the mountain, he reckoned he might as well relieve them of a little money while they were standing around admiring all the scenery. After all, there was way more cash to be made from these tourists than there was by trapping bears or selling hides. With that in mind, Levi opened a general store right next to the new hotel. Most folks said that Levi had lost his mind. There was no way his business venture would ever be successful. After all, Levi couldn't read or write a lick. How would he ever keep track of inventory and customer accounts? But that wasn't no hill for a stepper. You see, Levi came up with an ingenious system of keeping track of things. As soon as a customer would enter his store, Levi would greet him at the door and have him stand against the wall. Then the aspiring businessman would drive a nail into the wall, just above the customer's head. And when they brought their items to the checkout, Levi would draw a picture of each item and hang it on the customer's nail. Then, at the end of the month, Levi would tally up the cost of all the drawings and bill the customer. And for the most part, the system actually worked, except for that time in 1904 when he was settling an account with Silas Hancock. Well, let's see here. Levi said as he pulled the drawings from Silas's nail, "You purchased a set of horseshoes, 2 sacks of flour, and a hoop of cheese." But Silas, well, he snapped back, "I didn't buy nary a hoop of cheese. I'll be darned if you're going to try and cheat me." Levi took one good look at that drawing and shot back, "Now, Silas, I know a hoop of cheese when I see one. Just have a look-see for yourself." Silas took one look at the drawing and just started laughing. "Levi, don't you remember? I bought a grindstone, not a hoop of cheese. You forgot to draw the hole in the middle." And then there was a time in 1918 when those city folks decided to decorate their cottages and their grand hotel with American flags. Levi watched from the front porch of his store in utter amazement. He couldn't fathom why folks would be promoting the government. You see, he had never even heard of patriotism. But I tell you, there were flags everywhere. Old Glory waved from each house and every window in the Grand Hotel. But the final straw from Levi came when one city slicker climbed a glorious white pine tree and chopped the entire top of it off. Before planting a flag at the top, Levi had seen enough, and he stormed into the streets and unleashed a firestorm of cuss words for destroying such a beautiful tree. So much so that Levi was arrested and fined $100 for his outburst. But still, despite the occasional misunderstanding, by the time he was an old man, the feisty mountaineer Levi Trenum became known as the mayor of Elkmont by those vacationing city folks. The grizzled hillsman led hiking trips all over the Smokies. He knew every creek, mountain, holler, and trail like the back of his hand, and he loved to reminisce about his hunting trips as those tourists listened with wide eyes. By the 1930s, Levi was one of the last true mountain pioneers and was even known as the spirit of the Smokies, and was even frequently invited to public ceremonies down in Knoxville, such as the one in 1932 when he drove his ox cart across the newly built Hensley Bridge at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. His epic hunting adventures were featured in Field and Stream magazine in 1910 and were forever immortalized in the 1927 best-selling book, The Lure of the Great Smokies. Even in his old age, Levi remained active, and when his faithful wife died in 1928, after several months of grieving, he made front-page news when he married another woman that was half his age. Finally, in 1936, just 2 years after Levi was forced to finally sell his land to the government for the creation of the Smoky Mountain National Park and forced to leave the mountains that he loved, Levi passed away at the ripe old age of 83 years old. Then they lovingly took his body back to Elkmont and buried him on the land that he had loved so much in a cemetery that is still located beside Jake's Creek today.
Barefoot boy on Jake's Creek running wild. Clouds only come told secrets to the child. Knew every bird, knew every berry sweet. By 13 summers, legend couldn't be beat. With a track blind king and a heart made of stone, 300 bears he faced and faced them all alone. From Sevier County hollers down to Gatlinburg town, they told the tale of Levi Trenum, the bear hunter renowned. Oh, Levi, Levi, fearless and feisty and free. As wild as the trees. wind's control. Then the lumberman came with the whistle and steam, cutting the heart from Levi's mouth and dream. A railroad they built in a town called Elkmont Grove, where rich men from the city came to play and to view. Old Black Bill Walker and Levi held on tight, refused to sell out, refused to lose the fight. They laid him to rest where the rhododendron grows, by the chuckling cold waters that he'd always known, where the ghost of the bear and the sawmill's last sigh mixed with the wind as the train whistle cries. Now the tourists all wonder where Levi once stood, where this pine knot and bricks in the deep hickory wood. Oh, Levi, Levi, fearless and feisty and free, Lord of the Smokies, as wild as the tree.
During his life, Levi lived more than most folks could ever dream. He was born into a world of bear trails and buckskin, and lived long enough to see railroads, tourists, and the birth of a national park. And though the mountains changed all around him, Levi never did. He stayed stubborn as a chestnut stump and wild as Jake's Creek itself. Today, when the wind slips through the trees along that old creek and the mist settles on LeConte's slope, some folks still reckon that a piece of Levi Trenum is there yet, walking the ridges, telling his stories, and reminding us of what the Smokies once were, before the world came calling. When the government came in and took the land from thousands of people to create the Smoky Mountains National Park, no one embodied the American spirit of resistance than the people in our next story. Coming in at number 3 is the powerful story of the Walker sisters.
The government tried to take their home, but these women refused to leave the mountains that they loved so much. This is the incredible true story of the Walker sisters. The year is 1866, and John Walker has just returned from the bloody war between the states. It had taken a toll on John. After all, his home state of Tennessee had officially sided with the Confederacy, but John had fought for the Union and was even imprisoned because of his actions. But somehow he had survived and found himself looking to rebuild his life in the Tennessee mountains. John and his wife eventually settled in an area known as Little Greenbrier Cove, where John inherited 200 acres when his father-in-law died. It was a beautiful oasis hidden deep in the rugged wilds. The forest produced a bounty of everything that was necessary to survive: towering chestnut trees, black walnuts, hickory nuts, blackberries, huckleberries, and wild strawberries. John planted apple, peach, and plum trees and cleared land for crops of onions, Irish potatoes, peppers, turnips, peas, tomatoes, cabbages, and, most importantly, corn. The forests were full of wild game: bears, deer, rabbits, and squirrels. John let his hogs run wild so they could fatten up on chestnuts throughout the year. Nature also provided all their medicine, and there was plenty of catnip and pennyroyal, sassafras, turpentine, and balsam oils. Indeed, the mountains provided everything a man and woman needed to start a family. So it was here that John Walker, using an axe and a few primitive tools, built a cabin made of yellow poplar logs, and both he and his wife raised 4 boys and 7 girls. The family of 13 were humble people who who lived in harmony with the land. They built a one-room schoolhouse that also served as a church and lived a rich life. And for a time, they all lived in the humble cabin together as one big happy family. Remarkably, all 11 children reached adulthood, and the loving parents were able to see all 4 of their sons move away to start their own lives. They had lived a truly blessed life. But as we know, the hands of time pause for no one. In 1909, John's wife died, and a decade later, John would join her on the other side of eternity, leaving the land, cabin, and his wisdom behind to be carried on by his 7 daughters, Hattie, Martha, Nancy, Sarah Caroline, Margaret Jane, and Polly, the Walker sisters. Of all the women, only Sarah Caroline would marry and move away. In an age when all mountain women married very young, the 6 Walker sisters never married and lived together in the cabin their father had built for them in the aftermath of the Civil War. They raised all their own livestock, spun wool, churned butter, tended the crops, canned vegetables, and smoked their pork just the way their father had taught them. There was no electricity. Instead, they kept all their food in a spring house to keep it cool. Each sister worked as hard as any man ever aspired. In their mountain kingdom, they were isolated from the fast-paced world that was ever encroaching just beyond the hills. Yet little did they know that this new modern world would soon be knocking at their door, led by the federal government, looking to take everything from them. But the sisters were bound and determined to put up a fight with the government that would change the course of history. By the 1920s, the mountains had been looted of much of its natural resources by the wealthy businessmen who ran the coal and timber industries. Gone were the virgin forests, and mining had polluted many of the mountain streams, all in the name of progress. Many folks today don't even realize it, but the mountains were stripped bare back in those days, completely ravaged. And once those companies had extracted their riches, they had no more use for the land. So in the ultimate middle finger to American taxpayers, they sold their large tracts of land to the government, profiting one last time. It was then that many groups began to push for legislation to protect this newly acquired land by declaring it to be a national park. The problem was that there were still thousands of families living in those mountains. In a twist of irony, the very families who had lived in harmony with the land were suddenly forced by the government to vacate their homes and give up their land and way of life. The entire movement was highly controversial, to say the least. Many families saw this as an opportunity to move out of the mountains into a valley town and trade their lives of pioneer living for a life of working in a factory job. But there were also many others who resisted the government, vowing to fight for their land. In their minds, it simply wasn't for sale, and for those folks, the government simply used eminent domain to take the land from them. Yet, among the mountaineers who fought the hardest against the government stealing their land, none resisted as valiantly and as long as the Walker sisters. For over a decade, the state of Tennessee tried to purchase their land or use political coercion to force them off it, but the sisters wouldn't budge. Even though the Great Smoky Mountain National Park was established in 1926, the government had a major problem. The Walker sisters hadn't budged. They were still clinging to the cabin their father had built, and to the only lifestyle they had ever known. Although Nancy died in 1931, the remaining 5 Walker sisters never stopped fighting the government in the courts. However, in the end, the result was that the government took their land and home through eminent domain. Yet, the powers that be knew it would be a political nightmare and public nightmare if taxpayers learned that 5 women were forced out of their homes. So a deal was struck to let them live in their cabin for the rest of their lives. I need to pause here for a moment, because this is where folks will usually say things like, it was a good thing the park was created to protect the land, or they were allowed to live there for the rest of their lives, so it wasn't a big deal. To that, I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts. First, I guarantee that those who had their homes taken by the government would disagree, and I'm willing to bet that no one living today would agree to have their home taken by the government. Secondly, yes, they were allowed to live the rest of their lives in their cabin, but make no mistake about it, they were now tenants, and the government was their landlord. No longer were they able to hunt or grow large crops. The land was now owned by the government, and their self-sufficient lifestyle was stolen from them. With that said, the Walker sisters refused to leave, and despite the new restrictions, they lived the simple life the best they could. They still raised a garden, sheep, chickens, and hogs. They spun wool and made their own clothing and blankets. They once said the only thing they couldn't grow themselves was sugar, salt, and coffee. They were living windows to the past, but it wasn't until 1946 that the public found out about them when the Saturday Evening Post featured a story on them. And soon, people flocked from all over the world to their small cabin to see the Walker sisters for themselves. At first, the sisters were cautious and skeptical about all of the strangers who made the pilgrimage to their cabin. But eventually, they embraced the notoriety and would invite visitors in for lunch or supper. In true Appalachian spirit, they adapted and began selling handmade dolls, hot apple pies, and poetry to the visitors, which helped the sisters make a living. As the years passed, each sister eventually left the world, with Louisa being the last in 1964. Today, their cabin still stands as a reminder of the Walker sisters' legacy, a symbol of resilience and tradition in the Smoky Mountains. It stood sturdy against the elements, filled with the echoes of family stories, laughter, and the quiet sounds of daily work. The sisters grew their own food, tended to their animals, and spun their own wool to make blankets and clothes. They knew the seasons by heart, and each one brought its own set of tasks, gathering firewood for winter, planting vegetables in the spring, and foraging for wild berries in the summer. What set the Walker sisters apart was not just their determination to live as their ancestors did, but the depth of their connection to the land they called home. The rugged beauty of the Smoky Mountains had shaped their lives, and they knew every tree, stream, and ridge like the back of their hands. They respected the mountains and took only what they needed, leaving the land as unspoiled as possible for the next generation. Even in their isolation, the Walker sisters became legends. Visitors from nearby towns and distant cities would travel to Little Greenbrier Cove just to catch a glimpse of these women who seemed untouched by time. The sisters would welcome them with stories of their family's history, offer a slice of freshly baked cornbread, and show off the hand-spun quilts they made on looms built by their father. Though they never sought fame, their way of life became an inspiration to many.
What an inspirational story and true testament of the Appalachian spirit. Today, all 7 of the Walker sisters rest in Maddox Cemetery in Wears Valley, Tennessee. Each tombstone bears the inscription, Sisters. Coming in at number 2 on our countdown of the greatest men and women to ever call the mighty Smoky Mountains home is a woman who was tough as nails, the legendary Lyla Maples.
Long before the Appalachian wilderness was tamed by outsiders, a red-haired mountain girl was becoming an American legend. Prepare yourself for the incredible true story of Lyla Maples. Our story begins in Swain County, North Carolina in 1877. It's here that a girl named Lyla Maples was born. Affectionately known as Lyla, the young girl was a child of the mountains in every way. Her ancestors had first arrived in America 100 years earlier and migrated south from Pennsylvania via the Great Wagon Road before settling along the Oconaluftee River in the land of the Cherokee, a sea of wilderness that was still untouched by the outside world. There were no roads or railroads, just a patchwork of animal trails that had been used by the Indians for untold years through the still virgin forest. For Lyla, this was home. From an early age, it was clear that this gal was special. You see, in an era where women and girls were seen but rarely heard, this blue-eyed gal with the long, flaming red hair was never afraid to speak her mind, nor was she one to ever stay in her place. That's right, she could hold her own with even the toughest boys who lived along the banks of that river. She possessed a quick wit and a sharp tongue that would make most boys have second thoughts about picking on her. And if one did have the guts, Lyla would gladly roll up her sleeves and throw down and give any lad a pummeling that they weren't likely to ever forget. It was for this very reason that as Lyla grew older, most boys wouldn't dare to court this feisty lassie. It was also frowned upon for girls to waste their time attending school, so Lyla never saw the inside of a classroom with her own eyes. Yet she was far from uneducated. Her mother spent many nights teaching Lyla how to read and the valuable skill of medicine that was practiced by the mountain woman. She learned how to make cough syrup from boiling cucumber's and when to use bone set or catnip for teas to treat sick babies, or sassafras and turpentine for blood disorders, and even special roots to treat kidney infections. In fact, by the time Lyla was 14, she was already an aspiring medicine woman, and her family began hiring her out to new or expectant mothers to help with household chores, assist with delivering babies, and to retrieve medical herbs from the forest to help ease the pains of giving birth. By all accounts, young Lyla Maples was already shaping up to be one heck of a woman. Enter into this story a teenage boy named Robert Woodruff. Now, Robert had been raised in nearby Jackson County, and like most folks, he had been born into a family who had never laid their eyes on money, let alone held some in their hand. But this youngster had a big heart and even bigger dreams. Although Robert was a bit awkward and shy, he was known as a hard worker and was full of ambition. And as that boy gazed out from his farm at those purple and blue mountains on the horizon that rose so high they seemed to touch the heavens, it all fascinated him. He had heard about the daring adventures that lumberjacks were having, surviving the wild animals and camping for months at a time in the rugged forest with the bravest of men who were chopping massive trees and embarking on epic journeys while riding those logs down the white-capping rivers, down to valley towns in flatland country to sell them and then return to the mountains and do it all over again. Why, a fella could earn a fortune out there, he thought to himself. So, by the time Robert was old enough to heft an axe, he bid farewell to his parents and made his way up the Tuckasegee and then the Oconaluftee rivers until he reached a bustling lumber camp in Swain County known as Smoky Mountain, where he was promptly hired on. Robert quickly proved that he could swing an axe with the best of them, and over the next few years, he began making his way up the ranks while living in the camp, yet working 6 days a week and even part of the day on Sunday left little time for leisurely activities. But eventually, Robert began courting the mountain girl, Lyla Maples, and most folks just shook their heads in disbelief. After all, the pair couldn't have been more different. With Lila's free and untamed will, she was more than a handful for any man, let alone this aspiring suitor with his meek and bashful disposition. But despite their differences, as the old saying goes, sometimes opposites attract. And as the seasons came and went, Lyla and Robert became inseparable as their love blossomed. And by the summer of 1898, the unlikeliest of couples were stitched together as one. The unlikely couple, Lyla and Robert Woodruff, were both in the prime of their lives. And although they didn't know it, they were about to embark on an incredible journey together that would make their story one of the greatest chapters in the annals of American history. With Lyla and her new husband both in their early 20s, they set out right away, making a new life for themselves in a small one-room log cabin along the river that Lyla grew up on. Everything they owned was made from the forest. Robert hand-carved the long table and benches, along with a simple bed frame from yellow poplar trees. And other than that, their only possessions were a couple of quilts that Lyla had made, along with a cast-iron Dutch oven that the couple received as a wedding gift, where they cooked all their food over the coals of the fireplace. By late 1899, the newlyweds had already welcomed their first daughter into the world, and for a time, each ensuing spring would mark the arrival of yet another baby. Life was good, especially with Robert making 50 cents a day for each 12-hour shift at the mill. And soon, the couple rented a small farm on the outskirts of an Indian reservation known as Cherokee to be closer to his job. There, the growing family lived side by side amongst the natives, who were both apprehensive and curious about their new neighbors, especially Lyla with those blue eyes. The Cherokee women were fascinated by this exotic newcomer, and they went out of their way to spy on her from the forest, secretly hidden behind trees, as Lyla hung clothes outside to dry, or as she gathered wood for the fire. They always seemed to be watching. Yet, eventually, several native women began to befriend Lyla, teaching her their recipes for food, sharing Indian medicine, and even opening up about their spiritual beliefs with her. Yet, life has a way of kicking a man in the gut when he least expects it. And in the winter of 1903, tragedy struck Lyla and Robert's perfect little world when Lyla took sick during her 4th pregnancy, and she barely survived giving birth. Her body was so depleted that she was unable to produce milk for the baby girl. And sadly, a few weeks later, despite all their efforts, the baby died and was buried in the frozen ground beside their cabin. Death was a cruel reminder of the harsh realities of pioneer life. Folks laid their dead to rest, and there was little time for grieving. But for Lyla and Robert, they would never get over the death of their baby. And as fate would have it, they also would never have another child. Instead, they would devote the rest of their time on this earth trying to provide a better life for their 3 children. The next few years proved difficult for their family. Robert's work was sporadic and greatly depended on the weather. During the rain and the snow seasons, he would go for months without work. And every time he was injured, the company would simply send him home without pay until he could work again. Now, by 1906, many mountaineers began hearing rumors and whispers of factory jobs down in the valleys below, and many of them began trading in their independent lifestyle in exchange for those steady-paying jobs at cotton mills. Desperate and dreaming that there might indeed be a pot of gold to be had, the couple loaded up their children and took the first train they had ever seen out of the mountains and down to Spartanburg, South Carolina, where Robert took up work in a hot factory. But it didn't take long to realize that this was no place for a man who had been independent all his life. No, sir. Now, he had a boss standing over him, belittling him, and telling him when to move, and what he should do, and what he wasn't allowed to do. And these people were so different. No, this pay wasn't worth it. And to make matters worse, their youngest child came down with a terrible case of pneumonia, and a city doctor was called in and prescribed some strange pills in a plastic bottle that he claimed would cure the child in a few weeks. Lyla insisted that it was the poor air quality, combined with the water that was piped into the house, that caused it, and she refused to give any child of hers any of those newfangled mystery pills. So she promptly cut up an entire sack of onions and heated them in a greasy pan until they were caramelized. And then she piled them on her son's chest and wrapped him in a blanket. And by the next day, his fever was broke and he recovered from the sickness. Right then and there, they agreed to move back to the Smoky Mountains. Only this time, they would cross them and try their fortunes on the Tennessee side in a place called Sevier County.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today.
The early 1900s had brought great change to the Smoky Mountains, and the forests that Lyla had grown up in were quickly disappearing. The Iron Horse and its steel tracks now stretched to the highest peaks as lumber barons were gobbling up the virgin timber to build America's cities. By now, the most accessible forest had already been scalped of their riches, and timber camps began springing up nearly overnight in the highest, most unforgiving altitudes. It was here that Robert and Lyla both found jobs to support their children. Robert was hired by the Little River Timber and Railroad Company to help build new bridges and trestles to span the massive hollers, while Lyla spent her days running a border house by feeding and providing room and board for the timbermen who would now live alongside their family. Their new house was actually a railroad car that workers referred to as cracker boxes. It sat on a short spur just off the main railroad in the lumber camp. There was no electricity or plumbing, and the boxcar was covered with a thin layer of tar paper with several windows rudely cut into it. And insulation? Well, it was non-existent. And many mornings they would wake to find the entire interior of the boxcar covered with a thin layer of snow that had seeped in through the cracks while they slept. Now, these logging camps were always located in the most desolate of areas, with sheer drop-offs of hundreds of feet. Robert and Lyla's boxcar was located right next to the tracks, and there was no land for a garden and much less for farm animals. They were now at the mercy of something called company script that they used to purchase their food from the lumber company that they worked for. Now, even though Lyla had insisted on bringing the family milk cow with them, it was only a couple of weeks before that cow disappeared and was later discovered to have fallen off one of the cliffs and broken its neck. Work for the timber camps was brutal. Lyla's days began long before the sun rose and ended long after it had set. She stayed busy cooking and cleaning for the men, while Robert worked 7 days a week, non-stop, until each area was depleted of all its resources. Then the family's boxcar would be pulled several miles away to the next pop-up lumber camp. Thus began a never-ending series of moves that the family would make over the next decade, working for the Little River Company. In some of the larger camps, the outfit would build a church that also served as a school for their children. But it didn't take long to realize that most of the money the couple earned was gobbled up just to purchase their food and clothing that they needed to exist. It was a vicious cycle, and many of the workers were now actually in debt to the very timber company they worked for. because their wages weren't simply enough to cover the expenses. And that company store, well, it was full of shiny things that were completely foreign to the mountaineers who had grown up in the self-sufficient lifestyle. Lyla spent many nights looking through a thick book that the company store ordered all its supplies from, called the Sears and Roebuck Catalog. It was there that she spotted a machine, that captured her imagination. Something that could stitch fabric together at lightning speed. Why, a dress that would take Lyla weeks to craft together by hand could be assembled in minutes with this revolutionary invention. And with Robert's blessing, the couple spent every penny they had managed to squirrel away and bought the first sewing machine that was ever seen in these isolated mountains. It took 18 weeks for the package to arrive, along with several yards of fabric. But soon thereafter, Lyla was copying the styles that she had studied in that Sears magazine and began sewing dresses for all of the women and the children. She even began making clothing for the men. Over the years, Lyla was perhaps the most important person in every camp that she worked in. She fed the men, clothed their wives, and even though the company provided city doctors who visited the camps every month, it was Lyla that the families turned to for natural medicine, which she had learned from her mother and the Cherokees. And Lyla made sure all her children got an education, despite the tremendous obstacles and hardships that Robert and her faced. Legends of the fiery, red-haired mountain woman spread from one lumber camp to the next. Along the little river line, loggers would ride the train up the mountain to see Aunt Lyla, the woman who could mend a ripped pair of trousers before supper, or stitch together a Sunday dress before the preacher even arrived, and who could cure a fever with nothing more than herbs gathered from the forest. Each time a man came staggering down from the high ridges with a crushed hand or an axe wound, it was Lyla who nursed him back to health. In camps where loneliness and danger were a part of everyday life, Lyla was much more than a border house keeper. She was the heart of the camp itself.
In Swain County in 77, a red-haired girl came down from heaven. They called her Lyla, Maple's fair, wild as mountain wind and air. With Cherokee close by her side, and purple mountains far and wide, she learned the roots and healing ways from mountain women in those days. Oh, Aunt Lyla, Smoky's queen, strongest woman ever seen. From forest creeks to clear blue sky, she kept those timber camps alive. With needle herbs and healing hand, she helped the hardest working man, and the mountain wind still testify. Lyla's spirit will never die. Then a mountain boy came along, a quiet man, both brave and strong. They wed in 98 that year and built their home by River Clear. Traveled timber camps and winter snow, followed the path log trains go. She fed the men and healed their pain till her legend spread through hill and plain. Oh, Aunt Lyla, Smoky's queen, the strongest woman ever seen. From forest creeks to clear blue sky, she kept those timber camps alive. With needle herbs and healing hand, she helped the hardest working man, and the mountain wind still testify. May Lila's spirit
Robert and Lyla Woodruff's life together began on the banks of the Oconaluftee River in North Carolina, and their epic journey together to build a future for their children took them all over the highest peaks of the Smoky Mountains, working in timber camps. And their hard work and determination did in fact pay off. You see, by 1917, Robert and Lyla had saved enough money that they purchased a beautiful farm in Sevier County, Tennessee. 70 glorious acres on an area known as Upper Middle Creek for the price of $800. And Lyla even paid to have another miraculous invention installed at the house called the telephone, so that she could keep up with all her children who had by now moved away to faraway cities down in flatland country, where they were able to provide better lives for themselves and their new families. Well, how about that? Talk about mountain strong. Talk about creating a legacy for your family. Today, both Robert and Lyla lay side by side at rest in the Pigeon Forge Baptist Church Cemetery in Sevier County. I have no doubt in my mind that when they entered into glory, they were greeted with the words, "Well done, well done." All right, folks, we've finally made it to the top spot of our countdown, and we've saved the best for last. He was independent, stubborn, feisty, part-time peacekeeper, and part-time outlaw. Coming in at number 1, the greatest legend to ever come out of the Smoky Mountains is Cades Cove's very own Sam Birchfield.
Some called him the greatest mountain man who ever lived. Others believe he got away with murder. Prepare yourself for the incredible true story of Sam Birchfield. Our story begins in the deep winter of 1840 in the long blue shadow of Roan Mountain in Carter County, Tennessee. It's here that a boy named Sam Birchfield was born in a small one-room cabin that had been built by his grandfather just 2 generations before in a remote area known as Tiger Valley, an untamed wilderness that was teeming with every imaginable wild animal. In fact, the valley had once been the hunting grounds of the Cherokee just a decade before. Young Sam grew up as much of a creature of this valley as the animals he hunted. In the summers, his feet grew as tough as leather from running across the rocky creek bottoms. And in the winter, he was never without his coonskin cap as he set his rabbit snares along the old trails that had been carved by the Indians. And although Sam was innocent of all book learning, he was highly educated by the mountains that taught him a different kind of literacy. He could read the forest in a way other boys read a primer. A bent blade of grass told him which way a deer had passed. He knew when rain was coming by the smell of the air, and when there would be a frost by the stillness of the birds. And by the time most boys were still clinging to their mother's apron, Sam was slipping through Tiger Valley alone. Indeed, the mountains were his classroom, and the animals were his teacher. By all accounts, the Birchfield family were cut from the same cloth as America's first self-sufficient pioneers. Theirs was a life of total independence that was built with strong backs and skilled hands. They were gunsmiths, coopers, weavers, and tanners. Sam's father could forge a gun barrel from a wagon spring and carve his stock from a maple tree. That's right. If they couldn't craft it themselves, they did without, since the nearest store was a day's hard ride away over the mountains. Not that they ever had much need for store-bought things. They grew all their own food on the steep hillsides and kept a few milk cows and a team of oxen. And, of course, they made all their own liquor, which served as their medicine and their currency. It was well known that the Birchfields had a long-standing reputation for producing some of the purest, most potent Who Shot John in the county. Sam's grandfather was a master distiller who passed on the closely guarded family recipe down to his son, and by the time Sam was tall enough to stand on a stump and look over the top of the copper still, his pa had passed the sacred knowledge to him. And so you see, for the first 2 decades of his life, Sam lived in a state of wild grace, completely free in the paradise of Tiger Valley. But during the 1860s, the long arm of a nation that was tearing itself apart began to reach into even the deepest coves, and eventually the drums of war that had swept across America came to Tiger Valley. And by 1862, just as Sam had taken a new bride, it was duty to country, or perhaps the pull of adventure, that came calling. And Sam, well, he would answer. He enlisted in the 59th Regiment of the Tennessee Confederate Mounted Infantry. For the next 2 years, the mountaineer turned soldier served in the gritty, brutal struggle for the control of the Cumberland Gap, which was a vital supply line that separated Kentucky and Tennessee. But it didn't take long for Sam to realize that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And it wasn't nary as glorious as those politicians had promised that it would be. And after 2 years of nearly starving on dwindling rations of salt pork and cornbread, Sam Birchfield was finally mustered out of service in 1864, where he walked back to Tiger Valley. Yet, when Sam returned home, he found that it wasn't the paradise that he'd left. Like so many families across the South, the Civil War had broken the Birchfields' way of life. The valley had been terrorized by bushwhackers from both sides who used the war as an excuse for robbing and plundering. Several times they had descended on the homestead, looting the smokehouse, driving off the livestock, and stealing anything they could carry. And the self-sufficient world that Sam's family had built was left scarred and emptied.
Sam knew that his family needed a fresh start and a new place to rebuild. So, with a heavy heart for what was lost and a flicker of hope for what might be, Sam, his bride, his parents, and all his brothers and sisters loaded up their wagons and their grandpa's copper still, and they turned their backs on Tiger Valley and set out for a new home. 150 miles away on a high, lush valley known as Cades Cove. And here, Sam Birchfield was about to become one of the most legendary men in American history. Now, Sam Birchfield was quite the spectacle of a mountain man. He stood 6'4" in his socks, with a thick mane of long, coal-black hair that he curled and kept as clean as any woman ever aspired to. And look at that beard, would you? Even the prophets of the Old Testament would have stood in awe at the majestic crop of whiskers that Sam proudly wore on his face. And what a sight he was for anyone who happened to encounter him, riding on his Jenny with an old quilt tossed across her back for a saddle and a looped logging chain thrown across that quilt that served as stirrups for his boots. He never left his house without his 5-foot-long flintlock bean rifle that was over 100 years old, laid across his shoulder, with a jug of moonshine in his other hand. Now, Sam was the type of man who stood behind his word at all cost. If he looked you in the eye and made you a promise while shaking your hand, you best believe that he'd go to his grave before he'd ever break that promise. He would go out of his way to help a friend in need. But he was also the type of man you didn't dare cross, because if you did, he wouldn't stop at nothing to settle a score with anyone who cheated him. Well, anyhow, it wasn't long after Sam settled in the Chestnut Flats area of Cades Cove and lived happily with the 700 souls that called the Mountain Valley home, that soon he became one of the most likable and respected men in the area. Sam built a watermill on his property, which he allowed all of his neighbors to use free of charge.
He shared his bear and deer meat with any family that was in need, and he even donated his time helping to build the primitive Baptist church. But whenever Sam wasn't doing charitable work, you could find him working the old copper kettle that he had carefully hid on his property. Just like his father and grandfather before him, Sam was a highly respected purveyor of stump water, and most folks in the cove appreciated this high quality product, which they used for medical benefits as well as being consumed by the gallons at every barn dance. That's right. It wasn't long before Sam was pumping out white lightning from his faithful 100-gallon still, where he would haul it by the wagon load down to the general store in Cades Cove and sell it wholesale to the store owner, who would then distribute it far and wide to those thirsty flatlanders down in Maryville and Knoxville. And as you might imagine, it didn't take long for those revenuers to begin making trips up to Sam's place looking for his hidden still. And as for Sam, well, he didn't believe there was any crime in turning corn into liquid. The real crime was getting caught. And for most of the time, the crafty mountaineer was always one step ahead of the law. And each time they tried to catch him, he'd be tipped off and move his still to a different location. Now, Sam got away with this for decades, and the law, well, they couldn't stop him. He hid his setup so well that many times the posses of lawmen would become lost for days in the mountains, so much so that Sam himself would have to go rescue them before they starved to death. However, that all began to change in the 1890s. Several times, Sam's operation was raided, and he was hauled down by wagon to the Maryville jail and booked on moonshine charges. That's his mugshot from his first arrest right there. Now, most of the time he made bail and beat the charges in court, and even became more legendary in his stubborn refusal to indict or name anyone else who was involved in his distribution network. But that all changed in early 1892 when a man named George Powell, who was also involved in the industry of turning liquid corn into currency, snitched on Sam and even led authorities to his still. Birchfield was promptly arrested, and this time he would serve 6 months in the Blount County Jail. Now, Sam would never forget the experience of being locked up and caged like an animal for doing nothing more than exercising his God-given right to make Mountain Dew. Nor would he ever forgive the man who snitched on him. That's right. For the next few years, Sam fumed over his conviction, and it all came to a head on a sunny December day in 1897. And what happens here has remained a mystery to this very day. You see, George Powell came home from a hard day's work, where he was greeted by his wife and children in the front yard. And as his 3 kids clung to his leg, a single shot rang out from the forest, and George was shot through the shoulder. He ran towards his house and collapsed at his door, where his wife drug him into the house and locked the door. Too scared to leave the cabin and go for help, instead, she waited until sunrise the next day to summon a doctor. But by then, George Powell was dead. But just who pulled that trigger? Was it Sam Birchfield or another rival of George's? After all, a man who makes it a habit of snitching is bound to make a fistful of enemies. Wagon tongue set the cove afire with theories, and finally, an emergency meeting was held down at the Baptist church to try and get to the bottom of it. And it was there, before a packed house, that one woman stood up and announced that she had seen Sam Birchfield's son-in-law tearing down Abrams Creek just moments after that gunshot rang out. Just like that, Sam's son-in-law, Hale Hughes, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At the trial, the prosecution presented evidence that the person who committed the crime left a trail of size 11 boot prints leading away from the cabin. And it just so happened that Hale Hughes also wore a size 11. And with no further evidence, Hale Hughes was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And it seemed for a time that the case was solved in the mind of the folks in Cades Cove. And that was until 2 years later, when Hale Hughes had a change of heart and wrote a letter from prison to the local newspaper, where he shared the details of what he said really happened that fateful day. According to his story, both he and Sam Birchfield were positioned at different vantage points surrounding George Powell's cabin. And he claimed that while he had every intention to shoot George himself, it was actually Sam who pulled the trigger. Just like that, the case was reopened and Birchfield was arrested for the murder in June of 1899. And despite a media sensation, the grand jury failed to indict him and Sam was released. The irony of this entire incident was that during the murder investigation, Sam's photos and life and times as an independent mountaineer and stubborn moonshiner who refused to pay taxes were splashed on the front pages of newspapers all over East Tennessee. And slowly, Sam actually became a folk hero for his brazen ability to outsmart and openly defy the law. And it wasn't just an image, because Sam never stopped, with his last arrest for untaxed liquor coming in 1907 when he was at the ripe old age of 67. Finally, the government figured if they couldn't stop him, they might as well hire him. And they did, literally. In 1910, at the World's Appalachian Exposition that was held in Knoxville, Tennessee, the United States government astonishingly gave Sam Birchfield a legal permit to operate his moonshine still out in public for an entire month at the exposition. A staggering 350,000 people came from all over America to watch the wily old mountaineer work the copper kettle like a true master. Even a United States federal judge came all the way from Atlanta, and federal revenuers came all the way from Washington, D.C. to marvel at Birchfield's skills.
In the winter of 1840, beneath a mountain sky, in a Tiger Valley cabin, we heard young Sam's cry. Played where Cherokee once hunted and panthers wandered at will. He learned to read the forest, the ways of wood and hill. Granddad's copper-hidden timber by a spring so dark and cold. By 12 he knew the family craft and secrets never told. Smarted the law in them Smoky Mountains towns, copper kettle bubbling, corn to shine so fine. Uncle Sam Birchfield, a legend in his time. He marched to Cumberland Gap when the drums of war did sound. Came home thin to a valley, burned but trampled down. They loaded up that copper still and rode to Cades Cove Green. Built a mill and shared his meat, kept his white light men unseen. Climbed the hills, but he moved before they came. They'd wander lost in Laurel while he fanned the flame. Till 97's a rifle crack split chestnut flights in two, and whispers named Sam
As an old man, Sam Birchfield was immortalized as one of the greatest men to ever live in the Smoky Mountains by best-selling author Horace Kephart in his 1913 epic book titled Our Southern Highlanders. Well, he eventually turned the moonshine operation over to his sons, who continued pumping out the Mountain Dew all the way up until the family's property was taken by eminent domain in the 1930s by the federal government to turn their homes into the Smoky Mountains National Park. And as for Sam, well, in his old age, he turned his life over to the Lord before he finally passed away in 1917. And if you ever find yourself in Cades Cove in the Smoky Mountain National Park, be sure to stop by the Primitive Baptist Church and take a walk through the small cemetery in the back. And there, you'll see a tombstone that reads, Sam Birchfield, lived from 1840 to 1917 and known as the long hair of Chestnut Flats. Well, folks, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. How did we do? Was there someone you think should have made the list? Let us know in the comments below. Till next time, my friends, be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.